Hello guys, welcome to Magic Bloodline. Today we have an incredible story for you. Fawkes appeared during Harry's sorting and burned away 51 tracking spells. Dumbledore's 60-year plan collapsed in minutes. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Fire That Remembered. The Great Hall smelled like melted candle wax and old stone and something else Harry couldn't name, something electric, like the air before a thunderstorm, except the sky above the enchanted ceiling was clear and scattered with early September stars. He stood in line with the other first years, shoulder to shoulder with kids he didn't know, wearing robes that didn't quite fit because nothing in his life had ever quite fit, and tried to look like he wasn't already overwhelmed. The ceiling helped, actually. It was impossible to feel small and anxious while staring up at something that beautiful and not feel something shift inside your chest, not calm exactly, but wonder, which was close enough. The floating candles threw gold light across 4 long tables packed with students who were already watching the new arrivals with the lazy interest of people who'd done this before. Harry caught a few whispers running along the Gryffindor table like a spark along a fuse. His name. He'd heard it in Diagon Alley too, the same way, a ripple moving outward from wherever he stood, people elbowing each other, pointing with their eyes. Harry Potter. Harry Potter. That's him, the one on the end. He kept his expression neutral. He'd gotten very good at neutral. 10 years at the Dursleys had been an education in making himself invisible, in taking up exactly as much space as he was permitted and not 1 inch more. It was a survival skill, and a bad habit, and tonight, for the first time in memory, some part of him was already tired of it. The girl beside him, the one with the enormous bushy hair who'd spent the boat ride across the lake reciting the names of Hogwarts founders with the focused energy of someone revising for an exam, was doing it again under her breath. Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, Salazar Slytherin, and the 4 houses are named for each of. You'll know which one you're in soon enough, Harry said quietly. She blinked at him. I'm just being prepared. I know. He almost smiled. I'm Harry. Hermione Granger. She said it like she was used to people not caring. Have you read Hogwarts, A History? Because the sorting process is actually quite. Then Professor McGonagall set the 3-legged stool down in front of the high table, placed the old patched hat on top of it, and the hat opened a rip near its brim like a mouth and started singing, and Hermione stopped mid-sentence with her lips still parted, staring. Harry watched the hat. The hat sang about the 4 houses with the theatrical confidence of something that had been performing the same song for 1,000 years and had absolutely no intention of stopping. The Gryffindor table cheered when it got to their verse. Slytherin applauded precisely, the way people applaud when they want to look like they're above applauding. Harry noticed Draco Malfoy at the end of the Slytherin table already, even though Malfoy hadn't been sorted yet, then realized he was looking at an older student, someone who just had the same sculpted, slightly bored expression, and something about that made him feel obscurely better about his earlier assessment of Malfoy. McGonagall unrolled a long scroll and called the first name. Abbott, Hannah. A pink-faced girl with blonde pigtails hurried up, sat on the stool, and had the hat dropped over her head. It took about 30 seconds. Hufflepuff, the hat announced, and the Hufflepuff table erupted with welcoming noise and someone started banging the table rhythmically. The names kept coming. Hermione went up, the hat barely touched her hair before it shouted, Gryffindor, as though the result had been inevitable. She walked to the table with her chin up and her shoulders set with quiet pride, and Harry thought she'd probably been hoping for that one. Longbottom, Neville. The round-faced boy ahead of Harry, the one who'd lost his toad 3 times on the train and had the permanently worried look of someone waiting for the next disaster, shuffled up to the stool and sat down so fast he nearly knocked it over. The hat spent a long time on him. Long enough that a few older students at the Gryffindor table started whispering. Long enough that Neville's hands, visible under the brim of the hat, were pressed flat against his thighs like he was bracing himself. Gryffindor. Neville practically ran to the table, beaming so wide his face looked like it might not survive it. Harry smiled for real this time. More names. Malfoy, Draco, and the hat barely touched blonde hair before screaming, "Slytherin," and Malfoy walked to the green and silver table with the kind of stride that made it clear he'd never considered any other outcome. He looked back along the line of first years once before he sat down, found Harry's eyes immediately, and gave him a small, measuring look that was somehow nothing like the contemptuous smirk he'd worn on the train. More like he was revising something. Harry filed that away. Patil, Parvati. Gryffindor. Perks, Sally Ann. Hufflepuff. And then McGonagall looked up from her scroll and her voice, still crisp and carrying, said, "Potter, Harry." The sound of the great hall shifted. Not louder, exactly, more like denser. The murmuring that had been running under the whole ceremony came up to the surface all at once, and Harry felt 500 pairs of eyes find him simultaneously and stay. He didn't look at any of them. He started walking toward the stool, keeping his pace steady, and he was so focused on looking like he belonged there that he almost didn't notice. Almost. There was a sound first. A single clear note, high and liquid, like someone had struck a crystal glass and the sound hadn't decided to fade. It came from above, and it came from the direction of the high table, and Harry saw every head at that table turn in unison, McGonagall's hand going still on her scroll, Quirrell's turban swiveling, Flitwick nearly falling off his stack of cushions, and Dumbledore, who had been watching Harry's approach with an expression of composed, grandfatherly warmth, went very still. A streak of crimson and gold dropped from somewhere near the enchanted ceiling. Harry stopped walking. The phoenix, because there was nothing else it could have been, nothing else in the world that color, that sound, pulled up from a dive and beat its wings once, twice, the backdraft scattering the parchment on McGonagall's lectern across the floor, and then it landed on Harry's left shoulder with the casual certainty of something that had been planning this for a very long time. It was enormous up close. Harry had a brief, entirely rational thought that he probably should have been frightened, because there were talons currently gripping his shoulder through his robes and a beak approximately level with his ear that could have taken off his nose without effort. He was not frightened. The phoenix was warm, startlingly warm, like standing too close to a hearth fire, and it smelled like something between cinnamon and rain, and when Harry turned his head to look at it, it looked back at him with one eye that was the deep, intelligent amber of an old ember, and it made the sound again, that single clear note, low and close. Harry heard it differently this time. Not just with his ears. Something answered in his chest. In the place that had been producing a low, confused ache since he'd stepped onto the Hogwarts Express, in the place that had been aching, if he was honest, since he could remember, something unclenched. Then the burning started. It wasn't painful. That was the strangest part. It felt exactly like the moment right after you've been holding something too heavy for too long and you finally set it down. The relief is so thorough it feels indistinguishable from pain for the first second before your muscles understand that the weight is gone. It started at his shoulder where the phoenix sat and spread in waves outward, and Harry watched, dimly aware that the entire great hall was watching him, as faint lines of light ran down his arms and across the backs of his hands and disappeared at his fingertips like they were burning away, being burned away, like thread being consumed by flame. He felt something pop loose from behind his left ear. A pressure he'd never registered as pressure, because he'd lived with it his whole life, and pressure you're born with is just the shape of the world. Then another one. Behind his sternum, faintly. Then one from the base of his skull. Then several in rapid succession from his wrists, his ankles, from somewhere behind his eyes that he didn't have a word for. The phoenix burned them away one by one, efficiently, without ceremony, and each one left behind a small echo of absence, there was something here and now there isn't, that stacked up like opened windows, until the room felt wider and the candlelight felt brighter and Harry Potter took a breath for what felt, very specifically, like the first time. He counted, later, in his dormitory, lying awake while his roommates slept. He'd counted them as they went, each distinct pop and vanish, each pocket of pressure dissolving into warmth. 51. But that was later. Right now he was standing in the great hall with a phoenix on his shoulder and the entire school staring at him in absolute silence, and the thing he noticed, the thing that cut through everything else with the precision of cold water, was Dumbledore's face. The old man hadn't moved. He was still in his chair at the center of the high table, hands folded on the table before him, long white beard catching the candlelight. He looked, from a distance, exactly like a man who was watching something wonderful happen. The composed smile was still there. The blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles were still warm and twinkling. But Harry could see the hands. They were not relaxed on the table. The fingers were pressed flat and white-knuckled against the wood, and the knuckles were pressing down, and the pressure in them was the pressure of a man who was holding himself completely, precisely, consciously still, because if he moved a single muscle he would do something visible. Harry looked at Dumbledore and felt, with a clarity that was startlingly new, the clarity of a person who has just had 51 layers of spiritual interference burned off their nervous system, that he had never, in any real sense, met this man. He'd seen him once before tonight, a brief glimpse in Diagon Alley. He didn't know him. He had no reason to trust him. He had no reason to distrust him. He simply saw him very, very clearly, and filed what he saw, and kept walking to the stool. McGonagall, to her considerable credit, had retrieved her parchment from the floor and was looking at Harry with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't the standard teacher's professional composure. It was the look of someone who has just seen something they suspected for a long time suddenly confirmed, and is still deciding what to do with the confirmation. Her eyes moved from Harry to the Phoenix to the high table and back to Harry, and her jaw was set in a way that suggested a significant amount of internal activity. Harry sat on the stool. The Phoenix adjusted its grip, settled its wings, and made a low thrumming sound that Harry felt in his collarbone. McGonagall looked at the sorting hat in her hands, then looked at the Phoenix, then looked at Harry. There was a pause. The hat, for its part, seemed to be exercising unusual restraint. "Potter," she said quietly, addressing the student and not the bird, "the sorting hat, will it work?" Harry asked, equally quietly. He didn't know why he asked. He just wanted to know. The hat answered. It didn't move from McGonagall's hands. Its brim mouth opened and it said, in its dry, contemplative rasp, "In your case, Potter, I don't believe I need to look very hard. I can feel the answer from here." A pause. Remarkable, really. I've never sorted anyone when I could see them quite so clearly. Usually there's rather more noise. Nobody in the great hall breathed. "Gryffindor," the hat announced. Then, in a quieter undertone that still somehow carried across the silence, it added, "Obviously." The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry got up from the stool, turned, and walked toward the cheering red and gold table, and the Phoenix went with him, wings half spread for balance, still warm against his shoulder. The older Gryffindors were applauding, the twins, the red-haired twins he vaguely recognized from the train, were standing on the bench and cheering with the whole-body commitment of people who'd been waiting for an event. The boy he'd met on the train, Ron Weasley, was staring at the Phoenix with his mouth open. Harry sat down beside Hermione, who was sitting very upright and looking at him with an expression of intense, barely contained scientific fascination. "Is that a Phoenix?" she whispered. "Yes," said Harry. "Fawkes," said an older Gryffindor nearby, a prefect Harry didn't know yet, her voice carrying an odd note. "That's Fawkes. That's Dumbledore's Phoenix." Everyone within earshot looked at the high table. The Phoenix, Fawkes, made no sign of having heard or caring. It was examining the food appearing on the tables with polite interest, and when a dish of roasted something appeared in front of Harry, it tilted its head at it with the patient superiority of a bird that did not eat roasted things but respected the traditions of others. Hermione looked at the Phoenix. She looked at the high table. She looked at Harry. She was clearly running calculations. "Harry," she said, keeping her voice low, during the, "I was watching," there was light running down your arms. Before you reached the stool. "I saw at least a dozen distinct." "I know," Harry said. "What were they?" "I don't know yet." He picked up his fork. The food smelled extraordinary. He realized, genuinely, straightforwardly hungry, which was not unusual at the Dursleys where hunger was a managed state, but the hunger felt different now. Cleaner. More honest. But I'm going to find out. She looked at him for a moment with that calculating expression. Then she picked up her fork too and said, in the tone of someone making a decision, I'll help, if you want. I've read quite a lot about residual magical signatures. I know you have, said Harry. She almost smiled. Down at the far end of the table, Percy Weasley, the prefect, Harry gathered, was deep in whispered conference with another prefect Harry didn't know. Harry caught fragments. Unprecedented. The hat spoke without being placed. Fawkes hasn't left the headmaster's study in years. Did you see Dumbledore's? He stopped listening and ate. At the high table, Dumbledore lifted his goblet and took a slow sip of wine, and the twinkle was back in his eyes, and the warmth was back in his expression, and anyone watching from the student tables would have thought he looked pleased and untroubled. He was good at this. He was very, very good at it. But when Quirrell leaned over and murmured something to him, half his body turned away from the hall so that only the flutter of his purple-clad sleeve was visible, Dumbledore's response was just 3 words, spoken quietly enough that even lip-reading would have been difficult, and his expression while he said them was nothing like warm. McGonagall, 3 seats away, was watching the new Gryffindor first year and his phoenix with an expression that had traveled through surprise, through something painful, and arrived at something that looked a great deal like resolve. She had known Albus Dumbledore for 40 years. She had trusted him, followed him, carried out his instructions, and told herself, on the occasions when those instructions felt wrong, told herself firmly, repeatedly, in the middle of the night when the doubts came, that he saw more than she did. That his perspective was longer. That he had reasons she wasn't privy to, and that was all right, because he was Albus, and Albus always had reasons. She had handed a 1-year-old boy to a half-giant on a motorcycle in the early hours of November 2, 1981, and she had watched that motorcycle disappear into the dark, and she had told herself it was right. She had been telling herself that for 10 years. What she'd watched happen to Harry Potter during the sorting, the light running off him in sheets, the succession of what were unmistakably breaking spells, charm structures dissolving in phoenix fire, the boy's entire posture changing in the space of 30 seconds as though something heavy was being continuously lifted from him, had given her an architecture for exactly what it was that she'd been, without acknowledgement, suspecting. 40 years of trust was a long time. It was also not nothing. McGonagall looked down at her goblet, and she thought, with the careful precision of a woman who had survived 2 wars by being exact about what she did and didn't know, about what she was going to do now. The feast progressed. The enchanted ceiling deepened toward midnight blue. The candles burned steadily. Fawkes made himself comfortable on the Gryffindor table, accepted a bit of something from Fred Weasley with the air of someone accepting tribute, and periodically made the low thrumming sound in Harry's direction that Harry was already learning to interpret as the Phoenix equivalent of "I'm still here." "You're fine." Ron Weasley, who was sitting on Harry's other side now and had overcome the speechlessness that the Phoenix had initially induced, was talking about Quidditch with the sustained enthusiasm of someone who had stored up years of Quidditch opinions and was finally releasing them. He was funny, Harry found. Not trying to be funny, just naturally. He told a story about his older brother Charlie, who'd apparently been the best Gryffindor seeker in a decade, with such unthinking pride and then such immediately embarrassed self-correction that Harry found himself genuinely laughing, which was, he stopped for a moment with that. Laughing. Actually, physically laughing, not the performance of laughter that he deployed at Dudley's jokes when it was strategically wise. The feeling was slightly unfamiliar. He was going to have to get used to it. "You all right?" Ron asked, noticing the pause. "Fine," Harry said. "Better than fine, actually." He looked down the table, at the candles, at the enchanted ceiling deepening toward full dark, at the faces of people who were going to matter to him, who were already mattering in the early, tentative way that things matter when you're 11 and everything is new. "Yeah. Better than fine." Fawkes turned its amber eye on him. The low thrum came again, deep in Harry's collarbone. Outside in the corridor, if you'd put your ear to the door of a particular unused classroom on the second floor, if you'd been there at precisely the right moment, you might have heard a voice speaking quietly and with great control into the dark. Low, measured, deliberate. The voice of a man rebuilding a wall while the mortar was still hot. "All right," Dumbledore said, to no one, to the dark, to his own reflection in a dusty glass-fronted cabinet. "All right." He didn't say it like a man accepting defeat. He said it the way a chess player says it when a piece he didn't expect to move has moved, the brief recalibration, the quick intake of breath, the moment of crystalline focus before the next move forms. He said it like someone who had 60 years of practice at adaptation and was preparing to use every year of it. He folded his hands inside his sleeves. He thought for a long moment, in the dark, with the sounds of the feast coming muffled through stone and corridor. Then he walked, unhurried, back toward the great hall, and by the time he reached the doors his expression had settled into something warm and composed and deeply, deeply familiar, and nothing on his face gave away what was moving behind it. Harry, eating treacle tart at the Gryffindor table with a phoenix on his shoulder and 51 fewer spells than he'd had an hour ago, felt the headmaster's presence in the room the way you feel a cold draft through a crack in a wall, not the wind itself, just the evidence of it, and filed it, and went back to his conversation with Ron about whether a Nimbus 2000 was actually better than a Comet 260 in bad weather. He felt alert. He felt awake. He felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for a very long time, and the air coming through was cold and good. He'd been called the boy who lived his whole life, but this was the first night that being alive felt like something that was his. The feast ended the way feasts end, not all at once, but gradually, the clatter dying down, the plates clearing themselves, the candles somehow dimmer and warmer, the first years beginning to droop with exhaustion and sensory overload. Percy Weasley materialized and shepherded the Gryffindors out through the double doors and into the corridor with the practiced authority of someone very pleased about his prefect badge. Harry walked with the group, Fawkes still on his shoulder, and students from other houses gave them a wide berth in the corridor, not hostile, just uncertain, the way people give space to something they haven't categorized yet. He caught Draco Malfoy watching him from the mouth of the staircase that presumably led toward Slytherin, and this time there was no measuring look, just something Harry took a moment to identify as wariness. That was interesting. Ron fell into step beside him. "So is he going to sleep in the dormitory with you?" he asked, nodding at Fawkes. "I don't know," Harry said. "Only Charlie'd be absolutely gutted. He wrote 3 feet about phoenixes for care of magical creatures and Professor Kettleburn said it was the most enthusiastic essay he'd ever received, which, knowing Charlie, probably means it was mostly about the fire." Harry glanced back along the corridor. The high table was out of sight, the great hall doors closed. He couldn't feel, he checked, any particular sensation of being followed or observed. "Ron, is Dumbledore usually at the feast? Does he usually talk to the first years?" Ron looked surprised by the question. "He usually does a sort of welcome speech thing after the sorting." "He didn't tonight, did he?" "He just sort of, I noticed that too, actually." He looked, Mom always says you can tell when Professor Dumbledore's actually happy versus when he's being professionally cheerful, like, the difference in the twinkling apparently. He trailed off, seeming to realize this was an odd thing to have retained. Mum met him a few times. "At order meetings during the war," she said. "She said the real twinkling is warmer." "Which kind was it tonight?" Harry asked. Ron was quiet for a moment. "The other kind," he said finally. Harry nodded. That confirmed something he hadn't been entirely sure was real, or imagination, or the strangeness of the night and the disorientation of having 51 spells burn off you in a public setting. Hermione, who had apparently been listening from 2 steps ahead while pretending to study the moving portraits, dropped back to walk beside them. "Harry," she said, in the tone of someone who has been holding back a question for approximately 45 minutes and has reached her limit, "the lights I saw, the ones that were running off you during the sorting, I've been thinking about it, and there are really only a handful of magical constructs that would burn away like that in Phoenix fire specifically." "Phoenix flame purifies." It doesn't just break hexes, it dissolves things that persist through normal counter curses because it attacks the magical structure rather than the effect. The only things that would require that kind of deep structural dissolving would be compulsion webs, loyalty anchors, monitoring constructs, or, Hermione, Harry said. She stopped. I know, he said. She studied him. You know. Not all of it. Not yet. But yes. He looked ahead, up the staircase, at the moving portraits flickering in torchlight. I know the shape of it. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her recalibrating. Okay, she said quietly. Okay. When you want to talk it through, you'll be the first person I come to. He meant it. He glanced at her sideways, and she had her chin up again and her jaw set with that particular Hermione Granger quality of someone who has decided on a course of action and will now execute it with total commitment. I might need the library access. Obviously, she said. I've already got a list. Fawkes made a sound that was, Harry was increasingly certain, laughter. The portrait of the fat lady swung open. The Gryffindor first years filed through into the common room, into the warmth of the fire and the deep red of the armchairs, and Harry stood for a moment at the threshold and looked at all of it, the fire, the notice board, the spiral staircase up to the dormitories, and felt the 51 absences in himself settle into something that wasn't grief, exactly, but was adjacent to it. Someone had spent considerable effort ensuring that he arrived here diminished. Quieter. More manageable. Someone had worked, with real craft and real intelligence, to make sure that when Harry Potter walked into this room for the first time he would feel small and grateful and faintly bewildered. He did not feel any of those things. He stepped through the portrait hole into the warm common room, and Fawkes spread crimson wings briefly as they passed through the frame, a wing stretch, nothing more, but it scattered light across the stone like scattered coins, and Harry set his jaw and thought, with perfect clarity, I want to know everything. Not out of anger. Not even out of fear. Just, this was his life. It had always been his life. And it was time to actually live it. Percy had materialized at the foot of the stairs and was explaining dormitory arrangements with the slightly desperate enthusiasm of a prefect who sensed that this particular group of first years was going to need extra management. Harry listened with half his attention and mentally filed names: Neville, who was nodding so earnestly he looked like a bobblehead; Ron, who was stifling a yawn; Seamus, who had managed to set his own sleeve lightly on fire during the feast and was now investigating whether the singed patch was interesting or just embarrassing; Dean, who kept glancing at Fawkes with the expression of someone who had always wanted a phoenix of his own and was nobly suppressing the envy. Good people, Harry thought. These were going to be his people. Right, Percy said, wrapping up, and I'd appreciate it if the bird, his name is Fawkes, Harry said. If Fawkes is to remain in the dormitory, any flaming should be kept to a minimum, since the bed hangings are original and, Fawkes opened one eye and looked at Percy with the patient, amber-eyed regard of a creature that had set things on fire for 1,000 years and did not require notes on the subject. Percy cleared his throat. Off to bed, then. Harry climbed the spiral staircase to the first-year boys' dormitory and found his bed already made, his trunk already waiting, his new book stacked with all the quiet possibility of unopened things. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Fawkes stepped off his shoulder onto the headboard with the ease of something claiming territory, and Harry looked at the high stone ceiling and did the thing that had been waiting the whole evening to be done. He counted. One by one, working through the sense memory of each small vanishing, each pressure gone. He got to 43 and lost the thread and started again and got to 49 before the exhaustion of the day began blurring the edges. 51. He was sure of 51. He lay back against the pillow. Around him, within minutes, the other 4 boys were asleep, the normal, uncomplicated sleep of 11-year-olds who had just had the best day of their lives and needed to recover from it. Harry stayed awake a little longer, looking at the ceiling, while Fawkes settled on the headboard above him and made the low thrumming sound that Harry was now, definitely, certain was intentional comfort. I don't know who you are, Harry said, very quietly, to the Phoenix. Not really. The amber eye regarded him from the headboard. A single note, brief and clear. "But whoever you are," Harry said, "thank you." The phoenix blinked. Ruffled its feathers once. Looked away with the slightly too casual air of someone who has been thanked and doesn't know what to do with it. Harry closed his eyes. In the morning, he was going to start asking questions. Serious questions, the kind that required a good library and a sharp mind and the willingness to follow the thread wherever it went. He was going to find out what those 51 constructs were, who had placed them, what they were meant to do. He was going to do it carefully and thoroughly and without announcing it to anyone he didn't trust. He was 11 years old. He had a phoenix. He had Hermione Granger and her list of books. He had, in the vague early shape of it, something that felt like a plan. Albus Dumbledore had 60 years on him. Harry Potter had his whole life ahead of him, and no one was managing it anymore. He slept. Chapter 2, What the Ashes Left Behind. Harry woke before anyone else. That was new. At the Dursleys he'd always woken early. Aunt Petunia had seen to that with the regularity of someone who believed that idle hands were the devil's workshop and that the devil's preferred workshop was apparently a cupboard under the stairs, but this was different. He wasn't jolted awake by a knock on the door or the sound of Dudley thundering down the hallway. He surfaced cleanly, like something rising from deep water, and lay for a moment in the grey pre-dawn light of the dormitory and simply felt. That was the word for it. He felt. Present and specific and awake in a way that 10 years of living in a house that didn't want him had never quite allowed. The other 4 beds had their curtains drawn. Ron was snoring with the committed enthusiasm of someone who had eaten a great deal of feast and expected to sleep through at least 2 alarms. From Neville's direction came the occasional muffled sound that might have been talking in his sleep. The fire in the small dormitory grate had burned down to orange coals that threw a low warm light across the flagstone floor. On the headboard above Harry, Fawkes was already awake. The phoenix was watching the window, where the sky was doing the greater pearl transition of very early morning, and it looked, Harry found, once again, that reading the bird's expressions came more naturally than it should have, content. Purposeful. Like it had been awake for hours thinking about something and had arrived at a satisfying conclusion. "Morning," Harry said. Fawkes looked down at him with one amber eye. The low thrum. Harry sat up, pushed his glasses on, and ran his hands through his hair, which accomplished nothing constructive. He looked at his hands. In the low firelight they looked the same as always, too thin, with a white line of old scar tissue along the left palm from a garden shears incident that Aunt Petunia had never acknowledged, but they didn't feel the same. There was a current in them that hadn't been there before. Or rather, he was beginning to understand, there was a current that had always been there, and he could feel it now for the first time because the 51 things that had been muffling it were gone. He flexed his fingers slowly. The fire in the grate flared briefly. One bright pulse of orange gold, enough to light the room for a second before settling back. He'd done that. He hadn't meant to, but he'd done it, a small ambient push of magic from his hands reaching the nearest available source and influencing it. He stared at the fire. It stared back, indifferent and warm. He did it again, deliberately. Looked at the coals, thought brighter, and pushed gently. The fire climbed 6 inches and held. He dialed it back, and it subsided. Up, down, up, steady. Like adjusting the volume on something that had always been there except the volume dial had been broken and now it wasn't. "Okay," Harry said softly, to himself or to Fawkes or to no one in particular. "Okay. That's real." He dressed quietly and took a piece of parchment from his trunk. He'd bought a roll of it in Diagon Alley along with the quills and ink, because something about the idea of proper writing supplies had felt important in a way he couldn't articulate, and sat cross-legged on his bed and began writing. Not in an organized way. Just, everything he could remember, in the order he could remember it. Every vanished pressure. Every distinct pop of dissolution. The ones on his wrists had felt different from the one at the base of his skull. The ones behind his eyes had felt more complex, more layered, like they'd been built in stages. There were clusters of them, 8 that had burned away almost simultaneously from his chest, which suggested they'd been woven together rather than applied separately. He wrote it all down. He had approximately 6 minutes of quiet before he'd need to go find the Great Hall, which meant 6 minutes was what he had. He was nearly done when the curtains on the adjacent bed stirred and Ron's face appeared, hair at angles that defied the basic geometry of sleep. He blinked at Harry. At the parchment. At Fawkes on the headboard. At the parchment again. "It's 5:30, Ron said. "I know. In the morning." "Yes." Ron considered this for a moment with the expression of someone who has eaten too much treacle tart and gone to bed too late to engage properly with philosophical differences about morning. He looked at Fawkes again. Fawkes looked back. "Did he sleep on that all night?" Ron asked. "He was already awake when I got up." Ron was quiet for another moment. Then, Mum always says phoenixes only bond with people of exceptional character. He said it in the slightly embarrassed way people say things that sound like compliments when they're too British for compliments. "So. You know." He pulled his curtains shut again. There was a pause. Then his voice came through the curtains, "I'll get up at 6. That's civilized." Harry almost smiled. He finished his notes, capped his ink, and took the parchment and went to find the bathroom. The Great Hall at 6:15 in the morning was a different country from the Great Hall at the feast. For long tables, no students, the enchanted ceiling showing a flat pale sky that was the absolute zero enthusiasm grey of early September mornings in Scotland. A handful of owls were still navigating their way out through the upper windows, and the few who were still there eyed Harry with the professional wariness of owls who had been on the early shift and felt they deserved more acknowledgement for it. There was food, though. The tables populated themselves as if responding to his presence, or possibly this was just the normal magic of the place, breakfast appearing on a rolling basis rather than all at once. Toast, eggs, a small pot of tea that appeared at his elbow and was exactly the right temperature. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table alone in the enormous empty room and ate his toast and read through his notes and underlined 3 things. The cluster of 8. They'd been woven together. That was significant. Weaving spells meant they were designed to interact, to reinforce each other, to create a combined effect greater than any single spell would manage. Woven spells were complex work. Not impossible, but they required both skill and time, and the fact that they'd been applied to an infant, he was certain they'd been applied to an infant, because the way they'd grown into him, the way they'd felt when they left, was the way of things that have been there since before you had language, spoke to someone who had planned significantly ahead. The ones behind his eyes. He wrote perception alteration. With a question mark and then stared at it. The question mark felt dishonest, actually. He crossed it out and wrote it without the question mark. Perception alteration. Someone had been altering what he perceived. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious, nothing as clumsy as full-scale memory charms. More like a sustained dimming. Like someone had put a filter over his senses and left it there, so that the world he experienced was the world minus something for as long as the spells were active. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the 10 years at the Dursleys. The way he'd accepted it. Not passively, not without resentment, he'd always known it was wrong, but with a resignation that, looking back now with 51 fewer spells behind his eyes, felt manufactured. Like the acceptance had been installed. Something moved in his jaw. He became aware that he was clenching it and deliberately relaxed. He was not going to be angry about this the way that would make him stupid. Anger was fine. Unfocused anger was a self-inflicted wound, and he'd spent too long healing from the wounds other people had inflicted to add his own on top. Fawkes, who had apparently followed him down from the dormitory and had taken up a position on the end of the Gryffindor table some 10 feet away, maintaining distance, Harry was beginning to realize, when proximity would have been too conspicuous, made the single clear note. "I know," Harry thought at the bird. He wasn't sure if phoenixes worked that way. The note came again, different this time, a tiny variation in pitch that somehow communicated good, and maybe they did. The great hall doors opened. McGonagall walked in with the brisk early morning purposefulness of someone who had already been up for 2 hours and had opinions about the rest of the world for not being the same. She was in her teaching robes, carrying a clipboard, and she came to a full stop when she saw Harry sitting alone at the Gryffindor table at 6:15 in the morning with Phoenix fire-charred notes laid out in front of him. The pause lasted about 2 seconds. Then she collected herself and walked toward him. She sat, without being invited, but not in a presumptuous way, more in the way of someone who has something to say and is going to say it properly, across the table from him. "Good morning, Mr. Potter," she said. "Professor." He didn't put his notes away. He hadn't decided whether he was going to be careful with her yet, but he was going to be honest. He'd spent 10 years being careful in a house full of people who didn't want him. He was done with it. She looked at the notes. Not in a nosy way, in the way of a professor who assesses the quality of written work automatically, the way some people assess the quality of food automatically just by looking at it. Her expression didn't give much away, but her eyes were sharp, and they lingered on the page long enough that he was sure she'd read at least some of it. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked. "Clear," Harry said. He thought about it. "Like I got a full night's sleep for the first time." He met her eyes. "Professor McGonagall. What did you see last night?" She was quiet for a moment. There was something happening behind her eyes that was more complicated than what her face was showing, and Harry didn't push it, he let the silence do the work. "I saw," she said, picking her words with the care of a woman who has been a teacher for a very long time and knows how words land, "a phoenix perform what appeared to be a systematic dissolution of multiple complex magical constructs that were bound to your person." A pause. "Constructs of significant sophistication." Another pause. "Constructs that, in my professional assessment, were not there for your benefit." "No," Harry agreed. "They weren't." She looked at him, really looked at him, the kind of look that was about more than the conversation. He had the sense that she was seeing someone she'd expected to look different. Someone younger, perhaps, or less composed. "Do you know who placed them?" she asked. "Not with certainty." He picked up his quill. "I have a hypothesis." McGonagall looked down at her clipboard. She looked at the Gryffindor table's wood grain. She looked at the enchanted ceiling, which remained a flat and uncommitted gray. Her jaw did the same thing it had done last night, the set of someone managing internal weather. "Mr. Potter," she said, and then stopped. "You can call me Harry," Harry said. Not demanding, just easier. He wasn't much for formality when formality was being used to maintain distance. "If you want." She looked at him with an expression that he would later learn was McGonagall being startled and refusing to show it. "Harry," she said. "I want you to know that there are channels, within the school, within the ministry, that exist for, do you trust those channels?" he asked. The pause was longer this time. "That," she said carefully, "is a very sharp question for a first year on his first morning." "I've had a very informative 12 hours, Harry said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, more the recognition of a smile's existence, if that was a thing. "I want to help," she said, and the words were plain and unornamented, which meant they were real. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever you decide to do with what you know, or what you suspect, I want to help." Harry looked at her. He trusted his instincts more than he had yesterday. He was going to have to get used to doing that, and his instincts said this was genuine. "Okay," he said. "Good. I might need that." She stood, smoothed her robes, reclaimed her clipboard. "You have transfiguration at 9. Try to eat before then." She glanced at his notes. "And perhaps put those away before the hall fills up." She walked away in the direction of the staff table, and Harry watched her go and thought, one person inside the structure who could be trusted. He rolled his notes up and tucked them inside his robes. The doors opened again, and the first wave of sleepy, hungry students began to fill the great hall, and Harry poured himself more tea and started thinking about the library. The first day of classes was a useful study in what his new clarity actually meant in practice. In charms, Professor Flitwick had them attempt to make a feather twitch. Most of the class produced varying degrees of twitching. Hermione's feather spun in a tight circle. Harry's feather rose 6 inches off the desk, stayed perfectly still in the air for 4 seconds, and then came back down when he released the intent, not because he was being careful about showing off, but because he was concentrating on the quality of the connection, the feeling of the charm at work, and he wanted to understand it before he scaled it up. He felt the magic in a way he hadn't in his brief wand work in Diagon Alley, a current, steady and responsive, like water in a pipe that had just been cleared of a blockage. Clean pressure. The wand was a direction tool, he realized, not a source. The source was him. The wand just, excellent, Mr. Potter, Flitwick squeaked from 3 feet below, his face bright with professional delight. Most precise control I've seen from a first year in quite some time. He moved on quickly, but Harry saw him write something in his assessment book and underline it. Hermione leaned across the desk. 6 inches of sustained levitation on the first attempt, she whispered. On a Wingardium Leviosa. I've read about magical control in first years, and statistically the mean is barely a twitch, though of course sample sizes for exceptional cases are you taking notes on me? Harry asked. She went pink. I'm taking notes on the class. You have a separate column. Pinkier. I have a systematic approach, Hermione. He kept his voice low. I genuinely don't mind. I could use someone taking systematic notes. He looked at his wand. I'm going to do things that are worth noting down. She looked at him for a moment. Then she got her quill out and wrote something in the margin of her parchment. He didn't read it, but she was smiling slightly as she wrote it, which he took as a good sign. Transfiguration was McGonagall at her best, which was to say, rigorous to the point of being bracing, with a dry wit that most of the class didn't fully catch and Harry and Hermione caught simultaneously and exchanged a look about. She had them attempt to turn a match into a needle. Most of the class produced matches that looked slightly confused about their identity. Neville's match sprouted what might have been the very early stages of a pointy end before going back to being a match. Ron's match turned briefly silver before reverting with a small pop. Harry's match became a needle on the second attempt, not the first. He'd spent the first attempt deliberately running through the theory in his head, because he was aware that if he turned it on the first attempt without a wand movement while everyone else was still struggling he would spend the next 7 years explaining himself, and that was boring. He turned it on the second attempt with one clean wand movement, and McGonagall's eyes found him immediately, and there was a small nod that was more than a small nod. It was Dada that was interesting. Professor Quirrell's classroom smelled wrong. Harry smelled at the moment he walked in and it was bad enough that he stopped in the doorway for one brief moment before moving to his seat, because the smell was, not a real smell. He couldn't smell anything with his nose, not precisely. It was a sense impression, something the 51 absences had apparently uncovered along with everything else, a residue of something ancient and hostile layered under the surface of the room, concentrated around the front desk and the purple turban most of all. He sat at the back and watched. Quirrell was nervous. That was the public understanding of him, the stutter, the odd smell, the turban, the general air of a man who had been perfectly adequate in a less pressured job and had been mildly overwhelmed ever since. Harry had read this in the same social ambient way he'd read everything else, the murmur on the train, the prefect's gossip, the general background noise of a school where everyone knew the broad strokes of everyone else's reputation. But the nervousness Harry watched now from the back row of the Dada classroom was not the nervousness of an overwhelmed professor. It was more specific than that. It was the nervousness of someone performing. The stutter arrived on cue in the pauses that would benefit most from it. The turban, he caught himself noticing this, was adjusted with the habitual frequency of someone checking that something was in place, not of someone who'd wrapped a piece of cloth around their head and forgotten about it. The class was on basic magical theory and history. Quirrell gave it with the low-energy delivery of a man who had something else on his mind, and Harry took notes on the content and other notes on Quirrell, and by the end of the period he had written 2 columns of very different information. The second column had, at the bottom, a question that he put a circle around: why is he afraid of me? Because he was. Harry had watched the eyes. Quirrell's eyes, under the anxious helpful surface, kept coming back to Harry with a regularity that was too deliberate to be casual, and the expression when they landed was not contemptuous or curious or professionally assessing. It was afraid. Just barely, just beneath the performance of distracted professor, but Harry had spent 10 years reading the subtle shifts in people who had power over him and wanted to make sure he knew it. He knew what fear looked like. He knew how people stood when they were afraid and had to pretend otherwise. Quirrell was afraid of him. Why? Harry thought. He tapped his quill against the parchment. The feather on the end waved back and forth with each tap. What does Quirrell know about me that would make him afraid? He put his quill down. What do I not know about myself that Quirrell does? There it was. That was the question. He rolled up his notes and walked out of Dada into the corridor, and Hermione caught up with him immediately. She'd been 3 seats ahead and had apparently been waiting to match his pace since the doorway, and she said, without preamble, "Did you notice the smell in there?" Harry looked at her. What kind of smell? I don't know. It wasn't a smell exactly. It was more like, she frowned. Like the residue of a very strong magical working. Something old. I've read about ambient magical signatures and it said some people with developed sensitivity can feel. She paused. You felt it too? Yes. I think it's Quirrell, she said quietly. Not the room. Him. I think so too, Harry said. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing in the corridor outside Dada while the class streamed around them, and he could see in her expression the exact moment she decided to commit to the full version of the thought rather than the safe, partial version. Something is wrong with Quirrell, she said. Not, wrong like incompetent, wrong like something is in there that shouldn't be, Harry said. Hermione's breath caught. It was small, a tiny, controlled intake, but he heard it. That's a very specific formulation, she said carefully. It's the right one, Harry said. She was quiet for a moment, walking. Then, library after dinner. Library after dinner, Harry confirmed. The afternoon was double potions with the Slytherins, and Snape. Harry had heard about Snape the way he'd heard about everything connected to his history, in fragments, sideways, the kind of information people pass to children when they've decided to tell the child some things and not others. Snape had been in school with his parents. Snape had been a Death Eater and turned spy. Snape hated his father. These were the broad strokes. The reality of Snape was different from the broad strokes in the way that realities always were. He walked into the dungeon classroom and the temperature dropped, not literally but effectively, and Snape was already there, standing at the front with the kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation but controlled readiness, like a spring compressed. He was tall, dark-robed, pale, with black eyes that swept the filing students with an assessment that was so thorough and so rapid it was almost a physical thing. His gaze landed on Harry and moved on without stopping, which Harry clocked as deliberate, the glance of someone who had looked and looked away too fast, which was the same as staring. Be seated, Snape said. His voice was quiet. That was the first thing. Harry had expected loud and contemptuous and got something more precise, a voice calibrated to make everyone lean slightly forward so as not to miss something, which was a specific kind of power. He took roll. When he reached Harry's name he said, "Ah yes. Harry Potter." A pause so slight it was almost not a pause. Our new celebrity. A few Slytherins sniggered. Harry said nothing. He looked at Snape with the same attention he'd been applying to everything today, clear-eyed, curious, unrattled, and waited. Snape asked his famous opening questions. Harry knew most of the answers. He'd read the assigned textbooks cover to cover on the train, not because he was trying to impress anyone but because he'd been hungry for it, the hunger of someone who has been kept away from books their whole childhood and suddenly has 7 of them. He didn't volunteer the answers. He listened to Hermione try and fail to get called on from 2 rows ahead. Snape watched her raised hand with the specific theatrical neutrality of someone who had decided not to see it, and he watched Neville's carefully blank face and he filed all of it. At the end of Snape's opening monologue, the professor said, "Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "The draught of living death," Harry said. "Which is a powerful sleeping potion. The combination works because asphodel is in the genus Asphodelus, which in classical mythology is associated with the dead, and wormwood's bitter properties accelerate the suspension of." "Yes," Snape said. The word cut across the answer like a door closing. He stared at Harry for a moment. The stare was complex, it had multiple things in it that Harry couldn't fully read, which was unusual for him. Contempt was definitely there, or something adjacent to it. But underneath the contempt was something he couldn't categorize, and the something was doing more than the contempt was. 5 points to Gryffindor, Snape said, and the Slytherins looked as startled as Harry felt. Snape's expression gave nothing away. For an adequate answer. Now. Potions instruction is about precision, not enthusiasm. There will be no seat waving, no shouting of answers, and no performing. His eyes touched Harry briefly. That applies to everyone. Harry looked back at him steadily and thought, "You were expecting me to be different." It wasn't an unfamiliar sensation. Lots of people had been expecting him to be different lately. Too small, too ordinary, too unimpressive. Or they'd expected the opposite, the instant blaze of celebrity, the boy who knew he was famous and used it. Snape had expected one of those too, and Harry was neither, and that had produced, in a man who was clearly accustomed to reading people very accurately, something close to recalibration. What did Dumbledore tell you to expect? Harry thought. And how does what you're seeing compare? The class went on. Harry made his potion correctly, a simple one, boil cure, first-year standard, and spent the rest of the period watching Snape teach. Because Snape was, when you got past the controlled hostility and the house favoritism and the specific texture of something being performed, an extraordinary teacher. The precision of it. The information density. The way he moved through the room and caught mistakes before they happened, not because he was kind but because a misprepared potion was an affront to his specific standards and he could not let it stand. At the end of class, as they were cleaning up, Snape moved through the rows and stopped briefly at Harry's workspace. He looked at the potion, now a finished, correctly colored preparation in the file on the counter. He said nothing. He moved on. Harry caught, as he walked past, the same thing he'd caught from McGonagall that morning, a kind of complexity that was more than the surface performance. In McGonagall it had resolved into "I want to help." In Snape it was less legible. But there was something there. Something that Dumbledore's plan apparently required, and if the plan was Dumbledore's, and Snape was Dumbledore's man, and the spells were gone, how much of Snape's behavior, Harry thought, watching the professors retreating back, is Snape, and how much was managed? That question deserved the library too. Hermione was already there when he arrived after dinner, at a corner table in the restricted section's borderlands, not quite inside the rope, but as close to it as a first year could get without a specific reason, which meant she'd found a table that was close enough to pull from the nearby shelves and far enough to maintain plausible innocence. 3 books were already open. She had 3 columns of notes and a color-coded underlining system. Harry sat down and looked at what she'd found. The first book was Magical Bonds and Their Ethical Application, which was published in 1887 and appeared to be an academic text that had been used once and put on a shelf, given the pristine quality of the binding. The second was Compulsion Theory and Counter-Compulsion Practice. The third was more interesting, Legacy Constructs and the Ethics of Inherited Magic, which was open to a chapter called The Anchor Web, when multiple spells form a single system. "Read that," Hermione said, pointing to the third book's open chapter. She had a quill in her hand and was watching him with the expression of someone who has run ahead in the book and wants to see if the other person's reaction matches theirs. Harry read it. The anchor web was a term for a category of complex multi-spell binding. The entry described it clinically, a series of spells designed to interact, to reinforce each other, to create a unified system of effects that was greater than the sum of its parts. The web could track, suppress, redirect, and modulate magical output. It could install emotional dampeners. The text called them effective attenuation charms, which was a very clean phrase for what they did, that made a person less likely to question, resist, or seek outside the boundaries the web established. Applied to an infant before the magical core fully developed, an anchor web would grow with the core, integrating so completely that the person would experience their constrained, directed self as simply themselves. The web's primary function, the text explained, was control. The text noted that anchor webs had been extensively documented in medieval cases of magical slavery and in one notable 17th-century political case that the author described as the most thorough documented subversion of an individual's magical autonomy in recorded British history. They had been illegal under magical law since 1862. Harry set the book down. 8 of the spells you counted, Hermione said quietly, were almost certainly a single anchor web. The rest were individual constructs supplementing the web's function. Monitoring charms, those would let someone track your location, your magical output, your emotional state, probably your significant relationships. She swallowed. The perception alteration constructs are documented here too. They worked in conjunction with the effective attenuation charms to ensure that the subject experienced the world in a way that supported the web's behavioral goals. Harry looked at his hands on the table. Harry, Hermione said. And then, because she was Hermione and she said things the way they were rather than the way they felt easier, someone built a cage inside you. Before you could walk. Yes, Harry said. That's illegal. I know. He looked up. Illegal since 1862. And it took a phoenix burning it off to free it, which means whoever placed it knew what they were doing. Standard countercurse work wouldn't have touched it. He folded his hands. Which narrows the field considerably. Hermione looked at him with the expression she'd been wearing since last night, the one that was recalibrating what she'd expected against what she was getting. You're not surprised, she said. I'm angry, Harry corrected. Surprise wore off around lunchtime. Now I'm angry and I'm working. He pulled her notes toward him and read through them. She let him. This is excellent, he said. Seriously. This is better than I could have done alone in a week. She went pink again, but in a pleased way this time. I read quickly, she said. I know you do. He pushed the notes back. One more thing. Can you find anything on, he thought about how to phrase it. On phoenixes. Specifically phoenix bonding. What it means. What a phoenix chooses a person for. Hermione was already scanning the shelves. Give me 20 minutes, she said. Harry leaned back in the library chair and looked at the stone ceiling and thought about Dumbledore. Specifically, he thought about the hands on the table. The white-knuckled, pressed flat, controlled into stillness hands of a man watching his 60 years of careful work dissolve in phoenix fire. He thought about the fake twinkle that Ron's mother had apparently taught her children to distinguish from the real one, which meant it was a known quantity, a documented performance, and Dumbledore had been doing it long enough that the people around him had catalogued it. He thought about what the anchor web was for. Not just what it did mechanically, but what it was for. Why would someone place an illegal control system on an infant? Why monitor his location, his magical output, his emotional state, his relationships? Why attenuate his emotions and perception? What did they need him to be? Harry thought. And why? Hermione came back with a slim green volume and a slightly breathless expression. Phoenix bonding, she said, sitting down and opening it. According to this, phoenixes don't bond. Not the way familiars do. They're not bound by ownership magic or summoning charms. They choose. She found the page she wanted. Listen to this. A phoenix's alignment is with magical integrity itself. They are drawn to individuals whose magical cores are operating in a state of, and this is the word the text uses, authenticity. A magical core that has been suppressed, constrained, or redirected by external constructs will not draw a phoenix's attention, not because the core is diminished, but because the phoenix cannot see through the interference. The removal of such constructs, or the presence of a phoenix powerful enough to remove them itself, is required before a true bond can form. She looked up. Fawkes couldn't bond with you while the spells were active. He cleared them first, Harry said. And then chose. He chose. Harry thought about that for a moment. The warmth on his shoulder last night. The amber eye regarding him from the headboard. The low thrum that had said, repeatedly and without ambiguity, "You're fine. I'm here." "Hermione," he said. "The text says Fawkes drew to my authenticity. The real core, underneath all the interference." "Yes. So whatever those 51 spells were suppressing, whatever my magic actually is, without the anchor web and the monitoring and the perception filters, that's what Fawkes saw." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He looked at his hands again. "The small fire control this morning. The charms class feather. The match becoming a needle on a deliberate second attempt. And the sense, growing all day, of a current that hadn't reached its ceiling yet, a depth he hadn't touched yet, something that was there and available and waiting to be properly explored." "I haven't actually tried anything yet," he said. "Not really." "No," Hermione agreed. "I've been pacing myself. I noticed." He looked at her. She looked at him. The library was mostly empty around them, a few older students at distant tables, the librarian, Madame Pants, giving them occasional surveillance glances from behind her desk. The candles were warm and low. Outside the high windows, the grounds were full dark. "I'm going to find out what I can do," Harry said. "Properly. Systematically." He paused. "And I'm going to find out what Dumbledore knows that I don't. What the spells were in service of. What plan they were part of." "That's going to be dangerous," Hermione said. "Probably," Harry agreed. "I'm in," she said immediately. Harry almost smiled. "You didn't even think about it." "I thought about it," she said. "It took me 3 seconds. I'm fast." She closed her notes with a precise snap. "We should go back. It's nearly curfew." She hesitated. "Harry, about Quirrell. The signature in his classroom." "I know," Harry said. "Do you know what it is?" He thought about the hostile ancient wrongness of it. The concentrated wrongness around the turban specifically. The quality of it, not dark magic as a broad category but something more specific, something personal and very old and very cold, layered beneath the surface of a man performing normality. "I have a suspicion," he said. "So do I," Hermione said quietly. "And if I'm right, it's much bigger than Quirrell," Harry said. "Yes." They looked at each other in the candlelight of the library, two 11-year-olds sitting across a table covered in books about illegal magic and phoenix bonding, and the weight of it was real and serious, and neither of them was frightened. They were alert, both of them, alive with the quality of attention that comes when the thing you're doing actually matters. "Tomorrow," Harry said. "We come back tomorrow." "Obviously," Hermione said, and gathered her books, and they walked back to Gryffindor Tower through the dark corridors with the castle settling around them into its nighttime vocabulary of creak and drip and the distant, warm sound of fires burning low in empty rooms. At the portrait hole, Harry paused. He looked back down the corridor, the long, torchlit stone passage that curved away toward the staircase, toward the floors below, toward the headmaster's office on its tower. Somewhere in there, Albus Dumbledore was thinking. Moving pieces. Adapting. Harry turned and climbed through the portrait hole into the warmth of the common room, where Fawkes was perched on the back of a chair by the fire, apparently having convinced Fred and George Weasley to feed it something from a bag, and the sight of it was so normal and domestic that Harry felt the tight wound anxiety in his chest loosen slightly. "Coming in?" Hermione asked from inside. "Yes," Harry said, and went in. Chapter 3, The Shape of Things Underneath. The first time Harry properly tested what he could do, it was 3 in the morning and he was alone in the room of requirement, which he had found entirely by accident on his 4th day at Hogwarts. He'd been wandering. Not aimlessly, he didn't do aimless, but with the specific purpose of understanding the castle's geography, which was the geography of something alive and opinionated, full of staircases that moved and corridors that only existed on Tuesdays and a particular stretch of the 5th floor that smelled consistently of violets despite containing no flowers whatsoever. He'd been pacing the 7th floor corridor, committing the stretch between the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy and the blank stone wall opposite to memory, when the door appeared. It didn't announce itself. One moment there was wall. Then there was a door, plain dark wood, iron handle, ordinary in every way except for the fact that it had materialized out of solid stone because Harry had been thinking, with some intensity, that he needed somewhere private to work. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he opened it and went in. The room was large and empty except for a high ceiling, a stone floor, and the ambient magical quality of somewhere that wanted to be useful. It smelled like clean stone and possibility. The castle equivalent of a blank page. Perfect. He put his wand on the floor in the center of the room, sat cross-legged beside it, and thought. What he wanted was to understand what he was before he decided what he was going to do. That seemed important, not rushing the demonstration before he'd done the foundation work, not treating this like a performance to optimize for an audience. He'd been performing, in various forms, for an audience his entire life. The Dursleys had required a performance of smallness. The magical world had been expecting a performance of greatness. He was done performing. What he wanted now was just to know. So he sat, and he breathed, and he opened everything up. He'd been keeping a light rein on his magic all week, which was partly sensible and partly habit. The habit was the anchor webs. 10 years of suppression had left an operational ghost of itself even after Fawkes burned the actual constructs away, and he'd been catching himself pulling back on his magic out of reflex, like a person who has been told repeatedly not to run and keeps checking their pace even in open fields. He was done with that too. He let the rein go. It was like opening a door into a hurricane. Not violent, nothing broke, nothing caught fire, nothing exploded. But the sheer presence of it. The current he'd been feeling all week went from a trickle to a river to something he didn't have a word for. It moved through him in one long wave, floor to ceiling, and the room of requirement responded, all the ambient magic in the walls, in the stone, in the 7th century accumulation of spellwork that had soaked into Hogwarts like groundwater, it responded, because magic was responsive, because magic was fundamentally interactive. And what was moving through Harry Potter at 3 in the morning was something that the castle's magic recognized. The candles that had appeared along the walls when he entered blazed up 6 feet. He brought them back down before they scorched the ceiling. That was instructive, the control was there. It wasn't brute force and hope, it was precision scaled to a massive supply. Like having a very large engine in a car that handled very well. He picked up his wand and began. Spells he knew first. Wingardium Leviosa, he lifted the stone floor itself, a slab approximately the size of a dining table, 4 feet off the ground, held it for 30 seconds, and set it back without a crack. Lumos, the light from his wand tip lit the entire room like daylight, and he controlled it down to a single directed beam and back up again, watching the output, feeling the gradient. He went through the list Flitwick had given them for the term, finished the week's worth of material in 15 minutes, and then went to the back of the textbook. He spent 2 hours working through things that were technically 2nd, 3rd, and 4th year. Not all of it worked on the first try. The shield charm took 6 attempts before he could hold it without thinking about it. The summoning charm worked beautifully, Accio wand from across the room, the wand snapping to his hand like it had been waiting for the invitation. He spent 20 minutes on that one because the mechanics of it were interesting, the way the spell created a directed pull through any intervening space, and he started pushing the range, testing the limits, walking further from his wand before casting until he was on the opposite side of the room and it still came. At some point Fawkes appeared. Not flew in, appeared, in the quiet phoenix way, a sudden warmth and a flash of amber from the corner of the room. The phoenix settled on a high ledge and watched with the attentive quality of someone at a performance they've been waiting to see. "I'm not performing," Harry said. "The amber," I blinked. "Okay, maybe slightly," Harry conceded. He tried something that wasn't in any of the books Hermione had found him yet. He'd been thinking about the fire in the dormitory grate that first morning, the way he'd pushed it with just intent, no wand, no incantation. Wandless magic was apparently quite advanced, and in the textbooks was framed as something to be attempted after several years of formal training. He suspected this framing was built around the average. He suspected he was not average, and not because of arrogance but because the evidence of the past week pointed fairly specifically in that direction. He set his wand down. He looked at the stone floor. He thought up with the same clarity and precision he'd applied to everything else tonight. A section of the floor about 2 feet square rose smoothly and steadily, reached chest height, and held. He held it for a full minute, examining the quality of the connection, how much concentration it required, what the sustained load feel was, how it would compare to a combat situation where sustained concentration wasn't a luxury. The answer was, not very much concentration at all. The magic wanted to do it. It was like holding a door open rather than pushing it open against resistance. Once the initial push established the direction, the supply was steady and the demand was low. He set the stone down. Looked at his empty hand. The applications of this were considerable. He spent the last half hour exploring something Hermione's library books hadn't touched but he'd been thinking about since the data class, the hostile residue around Quirrell. He'd felt it as a kind of sense impression, a non-smell, a warning frequency. He sat very still and turned that perception inward and outward, inward to examine it as a faculty, as one of the things the anchor web had been dampening, and outward to explore what it could detect. The room of requirement had its own signature. Warm, layered, old and deep and accommodating. He could feel the broad shape of Hogwarts beyond the walls, a vast tangle of magical signatures, centuries of accumulated spellwork, the living castle. He could feel, as a faint warmth in the direction of the Gryffindor Tower, the sleeping signatures of students. And he could feel, very far away, down in the dungeons, something that was cold and quiet and watchful. He filed that under Quirrell and opened his eyes. It was nearly 5. He put his wand away, looked at the room that had given him exactly what he needed, and said, "Thank you," on the slight chance that the room of requirement had opinions about gratitude. The candles dimmed politely, which he took as acknowledgement. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the dark with Fawkes warm on his shoulder and the sense of his own magic settling around him like something finally wearing correctly, and he had, very clearly, 2 thoughts. The first, Dumbledore's plan, whatever it is, depended on me being significantly less than I am. The second, he's going to try to find another way to manage it. He's already working on it. I need to move faster than he does. Hermione noticed the change the next morning. She didn't say anything immediately, she was not impulsive with observations, which Harry was beginning to understand was one of her better qualities, but she watched him through breakfast and through charms and during the walk to History of Magic, and just before they sat down she said, quietly and without inflection, "You've been practicing." "Since Tuesday night," Harry said. "How advanced?" "4th year, roughly. Theoretically further in some areas." He sat down and got out his parchment. "The wandless work is coming cleanly." She looked at him for a moment. "How wandless?" "Stone slabs," Harry said. Sustained. A pause. "That's, Harry, that's 6th year minimum for most people. Most people had a full anchor web suppressing their magical core for the first decade of their life," Harry said. "I'm not comparing to most people. I'm just finding out what I am." She was quiet for a moment, and then, I want to come. I know you do. To the practice sessions. I know they're in the room of requirement. I saw it Tuesday night when I was up late. The door was just closing when I came around the corner, and I've been reading about it since. She set her jaw. I won't slow you down. My wand work is already ahead of the year. I know it is, Harry said. Come tonight if you want. She opened her notes with a brisk snap that he was learning meant satisfied. I found something in the library yesterday, she said, pulling a piece of parchment covered in her dense, color-coded handwriting from between the pages of a history of magic. I was looking for records of anchor web placements, documented cases, the legal proceedings after 1862, the registry they kept for a century after, and I found something. She passed him the parchment. He read it while Professor Binns drifted through the wall at the front of the classroom and began his account of the Goblin Rebellion of 1492 in the tonal register of someone who had died before they could develop an opinion about anything. The parchment contained a transcription from what appeared to be a ministry legal archive, circa 1944. It was a record of testimony in a classified proceeding regarding the use of long-term behavioral modification spells, and while the names in the original document were redacted, she'd noted this in the margin with 2 exclamation points, the circumstances were detailed. A 14-year-old magical subject. An authority figure. A purpose described in the testimony as the subject's development toward a specific necessary outcome. The testimony included the phrase, 3 times, in varying contexts, for the greater good. Harry stared at that phrase. 1944, he said. Yes, Hermione said. That's, Dumbledore defeated Grindelwald in 1945. Yes. He looked at the parchment for another moment. For the greater good had been Grindelwald's phrase. He knew that from the books, from Bathilda Bagshot's A History of Magic, from the general background knowledge of anyone who'd read about the war. It had been Grindelwald's justification for everything. His slogan. And here it was, in 1944, in a classified ministry proceeding about behavioral modification spells applied to a child. I can't prove it's him, Hermione said carefully. The names are redacted. But the timeline puts him exactly where these proceedings were happening, Harry said. And the language. Yes. And he would have been, in 1944, Dumbledore was what, 60-odd? He'd already been a professor for 20 years at that point. He had access, he had skill, he had the specific philosophical framework that would justify this kind of, this is circumstantial, Hermione said. I want to be clear. We can't, no, you're right, Harry said. He folded the parchment and put it in his robes. It's circumstantial. But it's the shape of something. He looked at the front of the classroom, where Binns was writing 1492 on the board with the mournful energy of someone who had been writing 1492 on the board for 30 years and found each iteration less satisfying than the last. Hermione. Where would Dumbledore keep records? Physical records, here in the castle. If he's been running a plan for 60 years, he'd have documentation. People like that always document. It's part of the control. You write it down because writing it down means it's real, it means the plan exists outside your head, it means you can review it and refine it. His office, Hermione said immediately. Which I can't get into. There might be other places. She chewed her quill tip thoughtfully. Hogwarts is, I've been reading Hogwarts, a history, obviously, there are rooms that respond to magical need. The room of requirement, which we know about, but there are also chambers that were built specifically by the founders for record-keeping. The castle's memory, Bathilda Bagshot calls them in Chapter 14. Stone archives that aren't accessible through normal means. She paused. She mentions that the castle itself tends to reveal these rooms to people it trusts isn't the right word for a building, to people whose intent it recognizes as aligned with Hogwarts's original purpose. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, Hogwarts was built to educate magical children. Yes. Someone installed an illegal control system on a magical child. Yes. I wonder, Harry said, how the castle feels about that." Hermione looked at him. "You can feel the castle," she said. It wasn't a question. "Since Tuesday night," Harry confirmed. It's a presence. Warm. Very old. Not hostile." "Maybe ask it," Hermione said, and the simplicity of it was characteristic, the most direct path between problem and solution, stated plainly and without decoration. Harry asked the castle that afternoon. Not with words, because the castle didn't do words. He went back to the 7th floor corridor, not into the room of requirement this time but just to the corridor itself, and he pressed one hand flat against the stone wall and did the thing he'd been doing in the room, opening his awareness outward, feeling the castle's signature, and then he pushed a specific intent through the contact. Not a request exactly. More like, "I am looking for what Dumbledore has hidden here. I am looking for the record of what he did. Show me if you can." The stone was warm under his hand. He felt the castle's awareness move, felt it was the only word, the same way he could feel magic through his entire body now, a directional sense, a current, and then something in the wall changed. Not the wall he was touching. Somewhere below him and to the right, on what would be the 5th floor. He found the stairs. The room was at the end of a corridor he'd walked twice without seeing it, because it hadn't been there to see, because the castle had a door here that only existed when someone looking for it was someone the castle had decided could find it. The door was old, much older than any of the classroom doors, the wood dark and banded with iron in a style that matched the castle's earliest sections, the ones that Bathilda Bagshot dated to the 10th century. Harry opened it. The room inside was small and very cold and lit by pale blue flames that burned in iron brackets along the walls without any visible source of fuel. The shelves that ran floor to ceiling on all 4 walls held what he first took to be stones, river-smooth gray ovoids, palm-sized, resting in individual iron brackets, hundreds of them. Then he picked one up and understood. It was warm, and when he held it the blue light changed quality, and he got an impression, not words, not images exactly, more like the emotional memory of something, a meeting, a decision, the feeling of being in a room with a very powerful person who had decided something about you without consulting you. Magical records. Not paper, not ink. The castle's own archive, impressions of significant magical workings preserved in stone. He put the stone back carefully and looked along the rows. There was no ordering system he could parse immediately, no dates, no names, nothing written anywhere. Just the stones in their brackets, row after row after row. Fawkes, who had followed him in, moved along the shelves with purposeful attention. The phoenix was examining the stones, moving its beak close to each one without touching, before moving on. It stopped at a cluster near the back of the room, on a shelf at about shoulder height, and made a single high note. Harry walked over. He picked up the first stone in the cluster. The impression that came was cold and precise and deeply, specifically focused, a magical working on an infant. A layering of spells, careful and sequential, with the particular quality of something being built rather than cast, the slow construction of the anchor web. He could feel, in the stone's impression, the magical signature of the caster, and he recognized it the way you recognize a voice you've only heard once, because he'd felt this signature in the watchful cold thing he'd sensed during the sorting, in the warmth that wasn't warm of the headmaster's presence in the great hall. He recognized it because it was everywhere in this castle, because this was Dumbledore's house and Dumbledore's work was woven into it, and this signature, careful, brilliant, old, with a specific cold thread running under the warmth of it, was Dumbledore's. He set the stone down with great precision. He picked up the next one. This one was different in texture, not the anchor web, something else. A monitoring charm, refined, tuned to a specific target. Harry felt himself in it, his own infant magical core like a fingerprint in the stone's memory, and the rage that moved through him was clean and cold and he set it aside. Not gone, just, set aside. He needed to think clearly. He worked through 6 stones. Each one was different. Some were more disturbing than others, there was one that felt like an emotional governor, something designed specifically to damp the intensity of his responses to perceived threat or injustice, which explained a significant amount about the Dursley years and how he'd managed to survive them without exploding, but all of them had the same signature. All of them had been placed on the same subject. All of them had been placed before that subject could walk. The seventh stone stopped him. This one was the most complex. The impression from it wasn't a single working but a layered intention, not the spells themselves, but the reasoning behind them, the decision that had preceded them. The emotional memory preserved in the stone was old and certain and utterly without doubt, and it was the feeling of someone who had read a prophecy and understood it and made a choice about what the prophecy required, and the choice was not protect the child and it was not help the child and it was not anything that required treating the child as a person. The choice was shape the weapon. Harry put the stone down. He stood in the cold archive room with the blue flames flickering around him and the knowledge of it settling into the structure of his thinking like cold water finding the cracks in stone, and the thing he felt most clearly was not what he expected. He'd expected rage. He'd expected grief, maybe. He'd expected the specific flavor of betrayal that comes from discovering that someone you'd been told was good was not good. What he actually felt was, of course, not in the resigned way. In the clarified way. The now it makes sense way. The architecture of the thing was visible now, the anchor web, the monitoring charms, the perception filters, the emotional governors, Quirrell in the data classroom, the stone in its vault somewhere below the school. He could see the shape of the plan from here. Not every detail. But the shape. Harry Potter was supposed to die. That was the plan. Not eventually, not as a regrettable possibility, but as the designed outcome. The anchor web wasn't there to protect him. It was there to keep him manageable, curious but not too curious, brave but not too capable, willing to sacrifice himself at the critical moment because the sacrificial willingness had been installed in him as thoroughly as everything else. He'd been built for a specific purpose. Fawkes stepped from the shelf to his shoulder. The warmth of the phoenix against his neck was the most real thing in the room. He knows the spells are gone, Harry said. His voice was even. He knows I'm going to figure this out. He's already adapting. He paused. What does he do now? He can't reinstall the web, Fawkes would burn it off the moment he tried. He thought. He changes the approach. He tries something less direct. Something I can't as easily detect and remove. Fawkes made the sound that Harry had started thinking of as correct. He tries to make me trust him, Harry said. He tries to be what the spells were, not through magic, through relationship. Through being Dumbledore. Through being the wise grandfather figure who has my best interests at heart. He looked at the shelves. And that, actually, is the more dangerous version. Because I can feel a spell. I can't always feel a carefully constructed affection. He took one of the stones from the shelf, the first one, the anchor web, and put it in his pocket. Evidence. The magical equivalent of a document signed and witnessed. He left the room, and the door closed behind him, and he thought it probably wouldn't be here the next time he looked unless the castle decided otherwise. He was fine with that. He had what he needed. He didn't tell Hermione about the archive immediately. He told her about the room of requirement practice session that night, and she came, and he watched her work for 2 hours and revised upward his assessment of her magical ability. She was already at the top of their year on precision, not the raw power he had but a quality of control that was its own kind of impressive, each spell exactly calibrated, no wasted output. She set 5 targets in a line and hit all 5 with a switching spell in 4 seconds and looked up with an expression of pure unself-conscious satisfaction that was nothing like showing off. Good, Harry said. I know, Hermione said, and set the targets back up. He told her about the archive 2 days later, when he'd had time to think through the implications. They were in their corner of the library, and he put the stone on the table between them and explained what it contained and how he'd found it, and she listened without interrupting, which, from Hermione, was the highest form of respect, and when he finished there was a long silence. Prophecy, she said. That's what the seventh stone implied. The decision-making that preceded all the spells. There was a prophecy involved. Do you know what it says? No. She looked at the stone. The Department of Mysteries keeps prophecies. Records of them. Orbs. She paused. We can't get to those. Not yet, Harry said. She looked at him. Harry, if Dumbledore knows the content of a prophecy about you and has been shaping your life around it for 11 years without telling you, that's not just illegal magical tampering, that's an entire life managed toward a specific outcome, Harry said. Yes. What do you want to do? He'd been thinking about this. I want to understand Quirrell, he said. Because whatever is in that turban, it's connected to everything else. The reason for the stone being here. The reason for the plan. I want to understand it before I act. He looked at the stone on the table. And I want to talk to Snape. Hermione looked startled. Snape? He's Dumbledore's man, Harry said. But I've been watching him. Something's shifted in him since the first day. He gave me 5 points in potions on day 1, Hermione. Snape gave a Potter 5 points. That didn't come from nowhere. He turned his quill over in his fingers. The anchor web was suppressing my relational perception, who I was drawn to, who I trusted, who I avoided. I think there were also constructs managing other people's perceptions of me. Not just my perception of the world but the world's perception of me. Snape was supposed to hate me and I was supposed to fear him. Without the constructs, both of those might be negotiable. Hermione was quiet for a moment, processing. You think Dumbledore was managing Snape's responses to you? I think he was managing everything he could manage, Harry said. Snape included. She looked at him with that expression he was learning to read, the one that was deciding whether something was brilliant or reckless and landing on both simultaneously. When? I'll find a time, Harry said. It needs to be private. The time came the following afternoon. He'd stayed after potions, not because he needed to, his potion had been correct and bottled and labeled precisely, but because Neville had had a catastrophic interaction between his porcupine quills and his potion that had resulted in a melted cauldron and the beginning of a detention and the specific expression on Neville's face of someone for whom this was entirely expected and completely devastating. Harry had stayed to help clean up while the other students filed out, and Snape, who had been conducting post-class inventory at the ingredient cabinets with his back to the room, said, without turning, Mr. Potter, your presence is unnecessary. I know, Harry said. He was scrubbing solidified potion off Neville's desk. I'm staying anyway. A pause. Longbottom's incompetence is not your responsibility. No, Harry agreed. But he's my friend. Another pause. Neville, who was on his hands and knees collecting cauldron fragments, looked up at Harry with an expression that was slightly damp around the edges. Harry didn't draw attention to it. He just kept scrubbing. Snape turned around. He leaned against the ingredient cabinet with his arms folded and watched Harry work with the particular quality of attention he'd been applying to Harry since the first class, that complex, multiple-layered assessment that Harry still couldn't fully read. Longbottom, Snape said. Leave the cauldron and go. Neville blinked. But I have detention for, served, Snape said. Go. Neville gathered his bag with the speed of someone who had learned not to question unexpected reprieve, gave Harry a look of startled gratitude that Harry acknowledged with a small nod, and went. The dungeon door closed. Silence. Harry kept cleaning. The desk wasn't going to get cleaner than it was now, but he gave it a few more strokes to let the silence establish itself without being the one who broke it. You could have sent me out as well, he said eventually. Yes, Snape said. Why didn't you? Snape unfolded his arms and walked to his own desk at the front. He sat in his chair with the deliberate quality of someone arranging the conversation's physical geometry. What are you looking for, Potter? He said. Not hostile. Not warm. Precise, like everything else about him. Harry put the rag down, turned around, and said, "I want to know what you know about the plan." The silence that followed was of a different quality from the ones before it. Snape looked at him with those dark, complex eyes, and Harry looked back, and the dungeon was cold around them and the empty potion bench between them was still faintly steaming from Neville's disaster, and neither of them moved. "What plan?" Snape said. His voice was flat. "The 60-year one," Harry said. "Dumbledore's. The one the anchor web was part of. The monitoring charms and the perception filters and the emotional governors and whatever prophecy is sitting in a glass orb in the Department of Mysteries right now." He watched Snape's face, very carefully. "I know he's been running it. I know the broad shape of it. I want to know the parts you were given." The quality of Snape's stillness changed. It was extremely subtle, a shift in the set of his shoulders, a barely perceptible change in his breathing, but Harry caught it. "How," Snape said slowly, "do you know any of that?" "Fawkes burned the spells off during the sorting," Harry said. "After that, I paid attention." Snape stared at him for a long moment. He was doing something complicated, Harry thought, running a rapid internal assessment, recalibrating, testing things against new information. His face gave almost nothing away, but the eyes were busy, and the eyes were not hostile. They were, Harry watched them, the eyes of someone who has been shown a thing they suspected and are deciding what to do about it. "I wasn't given the full architecture," Snape said finally. Each word chosen. "I was given instructions. Roles to play. I was told what you were to become. I was not told why, not completely. The prophecy's full content was," he stopped. "Withheld," Harry said. "Managed," Snape said, and the word carried a specific weight, the weight of someone who has just recognized something about their own situation. Harry looked at him steadily. "He managed you too." The muscles in Snape's jaw moved. "Do not assume, I'm not assuming," Harry said. "I'm observing. He gave you enough to get your compliance and held back the rest. He needed you to behave in specific ways around me, and he built the context for that behavior very carefully." He paused. "You hate my father." Snape said nothing. "Was that natural?" Harry asked. "Or was it managed?" Another silence, this one so long that the torches in the brackets actually flickered and recovered. "Some of both," Snape said, very quietly, and the admission was so unexpected, from this man, in this room, with this history, that Harry heard it land in the air between them like something irretrievable. He didn't press it. He didn't need to. He'd gotten more than he expected, and he knew the value of not over-pulling on a thread that was just beginning to loosen. "Professor," he said, picking up his bag. "I'm going to do something about this. About Quirrell, about the stone, about Dumbledore. Not yet, I'm not ready yet, but soon." He shouldered the bag. "I'd rather you were informed than not. I'm not asking you to help. I'm just telling you." He walked to the door. His hand was on the iron handle when Snape said, behind him, "Potter." Harry stopped but didn't turn. "What Dumbledore knows about the prophecy," Snape said. "He knows more than he told me. And what he knows, what it says about you, it isn't what he told anyone." Harry turned. Snape was still in his chair at the front of the cold classroom, exactly where he'd been, but something had shifted in his face, a quality of release, like a door opening slightly after years of being held shut. "What does it say?" Harry asked. "I don't know the full content," Snape said. "But I know it doesn't say what he implies it says." A pause. "Dumbledore told me you were the only one who could end it. I assumed that meant death." Something moved across his face, quick, gone, but real. "I'm beginning to think that assumption was also installed." Harry looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He went out into the dungeon corridor and walked back toward the inhabited castle with the torchlight amber on the stone walls around him, and Fawkes appeared from somewhere and settled on his shoulder, and the thrum was warm and certain. The shape of things was becoming very clear. Dumbledore had made him for dying. Had built the conditions for a specific death at a specific moment. Every spell, every charm, every managed relationship and dampened perception, it was all architecture for a sacrifice. But Fawkes had seen through the architecture to what was underneath. And what was underneath was not a sacrifice. Not a weapon. Not a managed boy moving toward a managed end. Harry walked through the castle with his phoenix and his clarity and the cool, focused feeling of someone who has just seen the full board for the first time, and what he felt, the thing underneath the anger and the grief and the rational assessment, was the uncomplicated, bone-deep satisfaction of someone who intends to make an entirely different choice than the one chosen for them. He was 11 years old, and he had never been so certain of anything in his life. Chapter 4, Controlled Burns. The thing about Quirrell was that he was performing all the time, and performance, Harry had learned, was exhausting to maintain. You couldn't sustain it without small failures, hairline cracks in the surface, moments where the underlying reality leaked through. He'd spent 10 years watching the Dursleys perform normalcy for their neighbors, and he knew what the cracks looked like. Quirrell had the same cracks, just different shapes. He watched them accumulate over 2 weeks. The stutter that arrived on schedule, never when Quirrell was alone in the classroom before students filed in. Harry had arrived 7 minutes early 3 times and watched through the door's small window as the man moved with completely fluid purpose, no stutter, no nervous fumbling, just a focused and coldly efficient preparation of the classroom before the performance of hesitation snapped into place the moment the first student crossed the threshold. The turban adjustments, rhythmic and frequent, that were not the absent habit of someone wearing an unfamiliar garment but the checked vigilance of someone making sure something was held in place. The moments in class when a question caught him off guard and the stutter vanished for 1 full second, just one, before it returned, and in that second the eyes were different. Wrong temperature. Too still. Harry mapped all of it. He kept the map in his head rather than on paper because some things you didn't write down until you needed someone else to see them. The first direct move came on a Thursday morning. Harry was crossing the 3rd-floor corridor, not the one with the locked door, though he'd already been through that particular lock in the first week and had a comprehensive picture of what was behind it, but the connecting corridor that ran parallel to it, heading toward Charms. He was alone. He'd left the common room 5 minutes before the others because he'd wanted to think, and thinking worked better for him in motion, in the half-empty early morning corridors with the castle warm around him. Quirrell was coming the other direction. Harry saw him at the far end of the corridor and kept walking. He'd been thinking about this encounter, not this specific one, but the category of it, and he'd decided the approach before it happened. He wouldn't initiate. He'd wait and see what Quirrell did when given opportunity. What Quirrell did was try to read him. Not obviously. They closed the distance between them, exchanging the brief nod of student and teacher passing in a corridor, and as they passed Harry felt it, a probe, light and precisely aimed, the magical equivalent of someone reaching out to see what they could touch. A mild surface-level legilimency, or something adjacent to it. Not forceful enough to qualify as an intrusion in any legal sense. A test. Harry walked straight through it. Not by accident. He'd been working on occlumency, not the formal discipline, which required a teacher and structured practice, but the natural version, which was the thing Hermione had found described in a very old library text as intrinsic magical self-coherence. When a person's magical core was sufficiently coherent and self-aware, surface probes simply found nothing to grip. Like trying to pick up a stone that was actually water. He felt the probe pass over him and find nothing and withdraw, and he kept walking, and he didn't look back, and he heard, at the edge of his extended perception, the faint change in Quirrell's breathing that was the involuntary response of something that had just tried a door and found it not merely locked but absent. He filed it. Fawkes was waiting at the end of the corridor, perched on a window ledge in a spill of grey morning light, and when Harry reached him the Phoenix made the note that meant "I saw," and Harry nodded once. "He's going to escalate," Harry said quietly. "He didn't get anything, so he'll try something else." He thought about it. Soon. The escalation came 2 days later, and it was elegant. Harry gave Dumbledore credit for elegance, the man deserved it. Professor McGonagall stopped him after Transfiguration on a Saturday morning with an expression of composed professional concern and told him that the headmaster would like to see him for tea at 3 o'clock. The way she said it was carefully neutral, and the careful neutrality itself was communicative. She was not the one who wanted this meeting, she'd been asked to arrange it, and she was conveying that information through the particular quality of the absence of warmth in her voice, which from McGonagall was its own kind of message. Harry said, "Thank you, Professor," and went to find Hermione. "He's making the move I predicted," Harry told her. They were in their library corner, which had developed the quality of a dedicated workspace over the past 2 weeks, the same table, always, with Hermione's books arranged in her system on the left and Harry's notes on the right, and a standing agreement with Madame Pants that they were allowed to occupy it indefinitely as long as they didn't fold the corners of pages. "He's going to try to build the relationship that the spells were meant to generate naturally." "What does he know?" Hermione asked. "About what you know, I mean. That Fawkes burned the spells. That I haven't come to him. That I've been in the library." He paused. "Probably that I spoke to Snape, depending on whether Snape is still reporting to him." "Is he?" "I don't know yet." Harry leaned back. "Snape is, I think Snape is in the middle of something. Like a compass needle when you move the magnet. He hasn't settled. He thought. I think he's reporting what he observed, that I asked questions and seemed aware of things I shouldn't be. I don't think he told Dumbledore what he told me." "Why not?" Harry turned his quill over. "Because he told me. Which means it was a choice. He knows the architecture of information control, he's been inside it for 20 years. He chose to give me something outside the approved channel. That's a position." He looked at the table. "I'll find out at some point." "What are you going to do at the meeting?" Hermione asked. "Listen," Harry said. "Let him talk. See what story he's built." He looked at her. "And be completely honest." She blinked. Most people would say don't show your hand." "I'm not hiding it," Harry said. "He already knows the hand. He needs to know that I know he knows. Because the moment I start pretending to be less aware than I am, I'm playing the role he built for me, and I'm done with that." He stood up. "Hiding would be the managed behavior. The installed one. What I actually want to do, what the real me wants to do without 51 spells telling me to be careful and small, is walk in there and be exactly who I am." Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's either the most strategically sophisticated thing I've ever heard or the bravest." "Hopefully both," Harry said. The headmaster's office was, objectively, one of the more impressive rooms Harry had seen, and he'd been living inside a magic castle for 3 weeks. The spiral staircase up the tower was made of moving stone steps that carried you upward without requiring walking, and the circular office at the top was packed with the accumulated eccentricity of a long, active life. The silver instruments spinning on their spindle-legged tables, the portraits of former headmasters dozing in their frames, a pensieve on a stone shelf, shelves of books that made Hermione's collection look modest. And in the center of all of it, behind a desk that had the worn, particular quality of furniture that has done real work for many years, Albus Dumbledore. He was standing when Harry came in, which was the first calculated move, standing rather than seated, already moving toward the small tea table by the window with its 2 chairs, the relaxed body language of welcome, the smile with the full warmth of it deployed at full intensity. The real twinkle, Harry noted. Not the other one. He was very good. "Harry," Dumbledore said, warmly, familiarly, as though they'd had dozens of conversations and this was the natural continuation of them. "Please sit down. I hope the walk up the stairs wasn't too much, they can be enthusiastic." "They were fine," Harry said. He sat in the offered chair and looked around the room with open curiosity, which was both genuine. The room was genuinely interesting, and a useful first move, because it let him map the space and read Dumbledore's response to being openly assessed simultaneously. "Brilliant office. One accumulates," Dumbledore said, settling into his own chair with the ease of a man in his natural element. He poured tea for both of them with the unhurried competence of someone who has been performing this particular ritual of hospitality for decades. Lemon drop? No, thank you, Harry said. Dumbledore settled the dish of sweets back on the tray and looked at Harry with the composed grandfatherly warmth fully deployed, and said, "How are you finding Hogwarts?" "Exceptional," Harry said. He wrapped both hands around his teacup. "Every class has been interesting. The castle is remarkable, I've been exploring quite a bit." He looked at Dumbledore. "The library especially." The tiniest pause. "Half a second, not more." "Excellent," Dumbledore said warmly. "Miss Granger's influence, I suspect." "We find things together," Harry said. "She's remarkable. Did you know she's already working through third-year transfiguration independently?" "I did not, though I'm not surprised." The smile. "Professor McGonagall mentioned you yourself show considerable aptitude." "She's generous," Harry said. The conversation moved through the comfortable motions of the first phase: school, classes, friends, the adjustment from Muggle life. Dumbledore was masterful at it. The questions were warm and interested and just the right size, leaving space for Harry to fill them with the texture of experience, and the experience of being listened to by Albus Dumbledore, who gave you his full attention with the practiced skill of someone who had listened to thousands of people and made each one feel like the first, was genuinely pleasant. Harry watched himself feel that pleasantness and noted it without dismissing it and kept going. When the opening phase wound down naturally, Dumbledore set his cup down and said, with a slight shift in tone that was barely perceptible and very deliberate, "I wanted to speak to you about the sorting, Harry." "I thought you might," Harry said. The events of that evening were quite extraordinary. He looked at Harry with the blue eyes steady and bright over the spectacles. "Fawkes's behavior was unprecedented, in my experience. He is not a bird who acts without reason." A pause. "I wondered if you might have any sense of why he chose to act as he did." Harry looked at Dumbledore. He thought, here it is. The first probe. Softer than Quirrell's, far more sophisticated, but the same function: reach out and see what's there. "I think," Harry said, "that he saw something in me that he recognized. And that before he could see it clearly, there were things in the way." He held Dumbledore's gaze. Things that needed to be removed. The quality of the silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. Dumbledore looked at him. His expression didn't change, the warmth held, the composure held, but behind the eyes something very rapid and very precise was happening. Harry could almost see it, the assessment, the recalibration, the decision about which road to take from here. The man had been doing this for 60 years. He made the decision in about 3 seconds. "Harry," he said, and now the tone shifted again, not withdrawing the warmth but layering something under it, something more serious, more intimate. The tone of a person about to share something important. "I should have spoken to you sooner. I know that. There are things in your history, circumstances surrounding your survival, the events of that Halloween night, that are complicated and that affect your life in ways that are difficult to explain simply." He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to know that everything that has been done with your safety and the safety of others as the foremost concern." "I appreciate you saying that," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him steadily, clearly waiting for more. "I want to ask you something directly," Harry said. "And I'd like a direct answer." "Of course," Dumbledore said. "How many spells did Fawkes burn off me during the sorting?" The pause. The absolute, complete, perfectly controlled pause of a man who has decades of practice not reacting to unexpected things. "I don't know the precise number," Dumbledore said. "Measured. Careful." "I counted 51, Harry said. "Some were individual constructs. 8 of them were woven into an anchor web, which I understand has been illegal since 1862. He set his teacup down. "I found the archive, Professor. The castle's stone records. I've held the impression of the anchor web's construction. I know the caster's signature. He kept his voice even, almost conversational. I know it's yours. The room was very quiet. The silver instruments on their spindle-legged tables turned and clicked in the silence. One of the portraits in its frame made a small sound, not a word, just the intake of breath before a word, and the portrait next to it made a small hushing gesture. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. The warmth hadn't gone from his face. That was the extraordinary thing. It stayed, real, or something so practiced it was indistinguishable from real, and what changed was not the expression but the quality underneath it, the thing the expression was covering. You found the castle's archive, he said. Yes. That room has been sealed since 1867, Dumbledore said. Not accusatory. Simply noting. The castle unsealed it for me, Harry said. I think it was waiting for someone with the right question. He paused. Professor. I'm not here to perform outrage. I'm not going to shout or threaten. I just want to understand what the plan is. The actual plan. What you built me for. Dumbledore was quiet. The fire in the grate crackled. A portrait on the far wall, an old witch in a tall hat, made a small motion as if she was going to say something and then visibly thought better of it. Fawkes, who had been on his perch in the corner of the office since before Harry arrived, his perch, the one he'd lived on for decades, made no sound at all, but his amber eyes were on Dumbledore with a steadiness that was its own kind of communication. You're 11 years old, Dumbledore said finally. Yes, Harry said. And I've been 11 years old with 51 spells on me managing what I thought and felt and perceived, and now I'm 11 years old without them, and the difference between the two versions of me is significant. He looked at the headmaster. The version with the spells would have sat in this chair and felt overwhelmed by you and grateful for the attention and probably cried a little, which I suspect was part of the design. He said it without cruelty, just as fact. This version is just asking a question. Dumbledore looked at him with something that Harry took a moment to identify because it was not what he'd expected. It wasn't calculation. It wasn't the quick chess intelligence of a man already 3 moves ahead. It was sadness. Real sadness, Harry thought. Not performed, not deployed strategically. The sadness of someone who has done something they believed was necessary and is now sitting across from the evidence of what it cost, and the evidence is an 11-year-old boy who is asking the right questions in the right voice with the right clarity, and the clarity is the thing they tried to prevent. There is a prophecy, Dumbledore said. Quietly. As though saying it quietly made it smaller. I know. It speaks of a child with the power to defeat Lord Voldemort. He paused on the name, old habit, Harry thought, the wince of a man who had spent years using it while everyone around him flinched. A specific child. Born at the end of July. Born to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. His hands were flat on the desk. You. Yes, Harry said. What does it say about how? Dumbledore looked at him. It implies sacrifice. Implies, Harry said. Or was interpreted to imply. A longer pause. The fire. The portraits, very still now, clearly listening. Interpreted, Dumbledore said, and the word was slow and careful and cost him something. Harry looked at him steadily. Snape told me you withheld the full content from him. That you told people what it implied rather than what it said. He kept his voice level. How much of the last 11 years was based on an interpretation rather than the text itself? Dumbledore was quiet for so long that the fire popped and resettled and one of the silver instruments completed a full rotation on its stand. I made assumptions, Dumbledore said, finally. Based on what I knew of Voldemort's magic. Based on the nature of the killing curse and what happened when it failed. He looked at Harry with the weight of 60 years of certainty beginning to look less certain. I believe that the protection your mother's sacrifice created could only be completed through a willing second sacrifice. I believe that you would need to die, Harry said. Walk toward death, Dumbledore said. Yes. And so you built a person who would be willing to do that, Harry said. Compliant. Not too clever. Not too connected. Brave but not powerful enough to think of alternatives. Loyal to the institution that would eventually ask it of him. He kept his voice even. He was not going to lose his composure in this room, not because he was afraid of showing emotion but because he wanted Dumbledore to hear every word clearly. You built me to die for you. Dumbledore didn't look away. That was something, Harry thought. He could have. For the world, Dumbledore said. I believed, I know what you believed, Harry said. I held the stone with the intention in it. I felt the decision you made when you read the prophecy. He leaned forward slightly. Professor. Here's what I want you to understand. The managed version of me, the one with the anchor web and the perception filters and the governors, that version might have done it. Might have walked toward death at the right moment because the willingness was built in. He held Dumbledore's gaze. This version is going to find another way. Not because I don't understand that Voldemort needs to be stopped, I understand that completely, but because dying is not the only solution, and the only reason it looked like the only solution was because you were building a specific tool and didn't look for alternatives. Silence. I'm going to find the alternative, Harry said. And I'm going to stop whatever Quirrell is planning in this school, and I'm going to deal with the stone, and I'm going to do all of it my way. He paused. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you because I think you should know. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long moment. You're remarkable, Dumbledore said softly, and it was not the warmth deployed strategically tone, it was something else, something unmanaged, and Harry heard it and acknowledged it and didn't let it move him from where he was standing. I'm just free, Harry said. This is what free looks like. He stood up. He picked up his bag. He looked at Fawkes in the corner, who was watching him with the amber eyes fully open, and the thrum came, warm, certain, steady, and Harry put it in his chest and kept it. I'll keep you informed, Harry said. About what I find with Quirrell. Because you should know what's coming. He looked at Dumbledore. And because I'm choosing to, not because you installed it. He walked out of the headmaster's office and down the moving stairs into the corridor, and the castle closed around him, warm and old and known, and he walked back through it with the stride of someone who has just won a very significant argument and knows it, and the knowing is not triumph but relief, the relief of having said the real thing in the real words. He told Hermione and Neville everything that evening. Not all at once, not in one exposition dump of a conversation that would have been both exhausting and counterproductive, but over 2 hours in the room of requirement with the fire going and the room having arranged itself, somewhat presumptuously, into a comfortable sitting room. Harry had been noticing for several days that the room seemed to anticipate. Today it had 3 chairs arranged around a fire, which was more than Harry had thought about specifically, and he took this as the castle paying attention and arranged himself in the middle chair and started talking. Neville's reaction was the one he'd been least certain about. He'd brought Neville in deliberately. Not because Neville was the most obvious ally, Hermione was the obvious intellectual partner, Ron was the obvious emotional one, but because Neville Longbottom had something specific that Harry recognized, he'd been managed too. Not through illegal spells, but through the slower, more ordinary management of low expectations and family disappointment and 10 years of being told he wasn't quite good enough. The effect was similar. The Neville who existed wasn't the full Neville, and Harry thought Neville deserved to know that someone could see it. So, Neville said, when Harry finished. He was sitting in the rightmost chair with his knees together and his hands flat on them and his expression cycling through several things at once. Dumbledore built all those spells on you. To keep you, small. So you'd sacrifice yourself at the right moment. That's the shape of it, Harry said. And the anchor web's illegal. Since 1862. And the castle has stone records of it. Yes. Neville was quiet for a moment. His expression settled. Okay, he said. Not small. Not the Neville who knocked stools over and lost toads and braced for disaster. He said it the way Harry had said all right in his own head the first morning, the recalibration, the breath, the steady preparation for what came next. "What do you need from me?" Harry looked at him. "I need you to keep getting better," he said. "You've been getting better since the first week. I need you to trust that." Neville looked slightly confused by the simplicity of it. "Longbottom," Hermione said, in her precise way, "you're already performing above your assessed level in every class. Harry's right. You just need to stop expecting to fail." "I melt a lot of cauldrons," Neville said. "You melted one," Harry said. "The first week. And Snape gave you the wrong preparation instructions for the base reduction. I watched him do it. I think it was deliberate. He's testing what you do under pressure." He looked at Neville steadily. "He's been doing it to both of us. Testing what we do when things are being made hard on purpose." Neville stared at him. "He sabotaged my potion." "On purpose, yes." Harry leaned forward. "Neville, here's the thing about Snape. He's not kind and he's not going to be kind. But he's an exceptional teacher who gives his absolute best students his absolute worst treatment because he wants to know if they can work without his approval." He paused. "I think that's also something Dumbledore installed, but it might also just be Snape." Neville absorbed this. Something shifted in his expression, not joy exactly, but the adjustment that happens when a narrative you've been living inside gets larger. "He's been watching us," Neville said slowly. "Everyone at that table is being watched by someone," Harry said. "What we do next is the important part." Hermione, who had been taking notes through most of this, because Hermione, and this was one of the things Harry genuinely appreciated about her, treated even emotional conversations as worth documenting, looked up and said, "We need to address Quirrell. Soon." "Harry, you said he's escalating." "He is," Harry said. "The reading probe in the corridor was a first attempt. When that failed, he went to Dumbledore. I think that's what prompted the meeting, actually. Quirrell told his host that the probe found nothing and the host wanted to assess what that meant. He looked at the fire. He's going to make a move for the stone. I don't know the timeline but the attempts are getting more frequent. He's already been past the third-floor corridor twice this week." "What's your plan?" Hermione asked. Harry had been thinking about this since Tuesday night. The plan had taken shape slowly, in pieces, the way good plans did, not assembled all at once but grown, each piece fitting against the next because it grew from the real structure of the problem rather than being imposed on it. "Quirrell needs to believe he's ahead of us," Harry said. "He needs to believe that the stone is accessible and that his path to it is clear. If he thinks I'm a threat, if he thinks I know about him, he'll either move immediately, which is riskier for everyone because the timing is his, or he'll withdraw and try again later, which just delays the problem." He looked at Hermione. "I want him to move on a timeline I control. I want to be there first." "How do you make him move on your timeline?" Neville asked. "I give him something that makes him think the path is clear," Harry said. "A piece of information, carefully placed, making sure it reaches him, that tells him a specific window is available." He looked at both of them. "And then we're there waiting." Hermione looked at her notes. "The defenses past the third-floor door, I've been through them," Harry said. She looked up. "Obviously you have." She sighed. "How difficult?" "Not very, for us. The troll is the only one that requires more than one person. Everything else is charm work and logic." He paused. "The troll is going to need the three of us." Neville straightened slightly in his chair. "You're going to be fine," Harry said. "I know," Neville said, and said it in a way that suggested he was starting to believe it, which was different from knowing it, but was the beginning of knowing it, and Harry thought that was enough. The fire burned warm in the room the castle had arranged for them, and the three of them planned in the way of people who are doing something genuinely difficult and know it and are not frightened of it, carefully, specifically, with the attention to detail that turns a complicated problem into a series of manageable pieces, and outside the room of requirement the castle breathed around them, old and steady. And if you were Hogwarts and had been watching this particular stretch of corridors for 7 centuries, you might have felt something that, in a building, functioned as relief. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday, and Harry chose the location deliberately. He found Quirrell alone in a corridor near the library at 7 in the evening. Not by accident, he'd been tracking the man's movement patterns for 2 weeks and could have produced a schedule, and he made no effort to approach casually. He walked straight toward Quirrell and stopped 5 feet away, and Quirrell's performance snapped into place immediately, the flutter of surprise, the stutter. Oh my, Mr. P. Potter, you startled me, I know what you are," Harry said. The stutter stopped. The flutter stopped. In the space of 1 second, the performance of Professor Quirrell, the nervous, overwhelmed, slightly pathetic Dada professor, vanished completely, cleanly, like a stage set struck in darkness. What was left was a man standing in a corridor with his performance gone and his real face on, and the real face was still and cold and something behind the eyes that was not entirely Quirrell. "You're very direct," Quirrell said. No stutter. A different voice, smoother, quieter, with an accent that wasn't quite right for a man who had supposedly studied in Albania. "I find it saves time," Harry said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Quirrell said, and the voice changed again, lower, smoother still, with a quality that was not Quirrell's at all. Something using Quirrell's throat. "Voldemort," Harry said. Said it flat and plain, the way you say a word that's been made frightening on purpose to see what happens when you take the fright away from it. "I know you're at the back of his head. I've felt you in this school since the first week." The hostile cold feeling in the Dada classroom and specifically around the turban. He looked at Quirrell's covered head. "Hello." The hallway was empty. The torches were steady on the walls. From somewhere distant came the muffled sounds of a castle that was full of people and life and noise, and none of it reached this particular stretch of corridor. Quirrell stared at him. Something moved in his face, not the man's own expression, something working through the man's face from behind. "You are not," the voice said, very quietly, "what I expected." "No," Harry agreed. "I'm not. The boy in the prophecy is described as, I know what Dumbledore believed the prophecy described," Harry said. "The managed version of me. The one built to be manageable." He kept his voice level and his gaze direct. "That version doesn't exist anymore. I'm what's left after the architecture comes down." A pause. The thing behind Quirrell's eyes was assessing him. Harry could feel it, a pressure, the same quality as the corridor probe but larger and more deliberate, pressing against his awareness and finding the same water smoothness it had found before. "Remarkable," the voice said, and the tone was almost academic. "You've developed a clemency without training. Intrinsic coherence," Harry said. "I've been reading about it." "Who are you?" The voice said, and it was not rhetorical, it was genuine, the question of something that has encountered an unexpected variable and needs to categorize it. "Harry Potter," Harry said. "I live here. This is my school." He kept his voice even. "You're going to try for the stone. I know you are, and I know roughly when. I want you to understand before that happens that I will be there. Not because Dumbledore sent me, he didn't. But because you need to be stopped, and I've decided to do it, and I'm telling you now because I think you should know who you're dealing with." The voice was quiet for a moment. "You're 11 years old," it said. "Everyone keeps saying that," Harry said. "I genuinely don't understand what age is supposed to have to do with it." Something moved in Quirrell's face. The cold behind the eyes quality, and also, something else. Something that Harry, watching very carefully, took a moment to identify. He'd felt it in Dumbledore too, earlier. The same quality, a different flavor. Recognition. He's reassessing me, Harry thought. Right now. In real time. He came to this school expecting the managed version and he's getting this version and he doesn't know what to do with it yet. Good. When I come for the stone, the voice said, I will not be gentle. I'm not asking you to be, Harry said. They looked at each other, the boy and the thing wearing a man's face, in the empty corridor, and neither of them moved, and the silence had the quality of two people standing at the beginning of something that has been set in motion and can't be unset, and both of them knowing it. Tell Dumbledore, the voice said. I already did, Harry said. He knows I'll be there. He's not happy about it. He paused. That's not going to change anything. He turned and walked away down the corridor, keeping his pace even, not rushing, and he didn't feel the probe again. The pressure withdrew and didn't return, and when he turned the corner toward the library, Fawkes dropped from a high ledge above and landed on his shoulder with the warm solid certainty of a bird that had been watching the whole thing and approved of the outcome. Okay? Harry asked quietly. The low thrum. Good. Voldemort's a better audience than Quirrell, Harry said. At least he dropped the stutter. Fawkes made the sound that was absolutely, categorically laughter. Harry let himself smile, the small, honest, private smile of someone who has just walked straight at something frightening and discovered that it didn't get taller as he approached. He needed to talk to Ron. Ron, who had been quietly watching the past 3 weeks with the loyal and slightly bewildered expression of a good person trying to calibrate to a situation that kept evolving. Ron, who had said nothing about the growing alliance with Hermione, because Ron and Hermione existing in the same space still produced the specific friction of two people who were too similar in the ways that annoyed each other, and nothing about the late nights, and nothing about the fact that Harry came back from solo walks looking like he'd been thinking about something significant. Ron was good people. He deserved to know. Harry found him in the common room, playing chess with himself, which was apparently Ron's way of practicing, the pieces squabbling with each other on Ron's behalf while he directed them with the ease of someone who had been doing this since he could sit up straight. The fire was warm. The common room was mostly empty at this hour. Harry sat across from him. Want to play? Ron asked. No, Harry said. I want to tell you some things. Ron looked at him. The chessmen went still on their own, as if they'd decided to listen too. Ron folded his arms on the table and gave Harry his full attention with the uncomplicated directness of someone who didn't know how to do anything but be present when someone needed him. Okay, Ron said. Tell me. Harry told him. Ron listened all the way through without interrupting, which Harry was fairly sure was a personal record. He sat with his arms folded and his freckled face cycling through expressions, the shock of the anchor web, the anger of the prophecy and the managed childhood, the wide-eyed alarm of Quirrell's real identity, the slightly defiant expression of someone who has just been told the odds are considerable and has decided to care about that later. When Harry finished, Ron said, So the troll? Yes, Harry said. The three of you were going to handle a full-grown mountain troll. Still are. You need 4 people, Ron said. Harry looked at him. I'm not saying I'm afraid of it, Ron said quickly. I'm saying tactically, you distract it, Hermione does the precision work, Neville does the ground game. You need someone on the door. You need me on the door. He nodded like the decision had been made. I'm on the door. Harry looked at him for a moment. You sure? Harry, Ron said, slightly exasperated, you've just told me Voldemort is sharing a head with our dada professor and Dumbledore built a control grid in your actual brain and there's a magical stone that grants immortality sitting somewhere under the school and you want to know if I'm sure. He picked up his king chess piece and put it back on the board. I'm in. Obviously. Harry almost smiled. You might have been my first friend if I'd asked sooner. Well, Ron said, with the carefully British non-reaction to sentiment that Harry was getting used to, you were busy. He looked at the chess board. I'll teach you chess. You'll need something to do while you're planning to take on Dark Lords at age 11. I'd like that, Harry said. He meant it. Outside the Gryffindor windows, the grounds were dark and full of wind, and the night was the deep autumn kind that made the castle feel more real for the contrast, and inside the warm common room Harry Potter sat across from Ron Weasley and let the chess pieces argue with each other about pawn placement and felt, cleanly and without qualification, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because anyone put him here. Because he chose it. Chapter 5, The Weight of 60 Years. The second stone Harry had taken from the archive was the one he hadn't opened yet. He'd been carrying it in his pocket for 2 weeks, the smooth grey oval, warm against his hip, the weight of it familiar enough now that he noticed when it wasn't there. He hadn't opened it because he'd known, with the same instinct that had been guiding him since the sorting, that there was a right time for it and that he hadn't reached it yet. Some information you needed before you could use it. Some information you needed to be ready for before it used you. He opened it on the last Sunday of October, 3 days before Halloween. He was in the room of requirement alone. Hermione had gone to the library. Neville was in the greenhouse. Professor Sprout had given him an open invitation after he'd produced the most robustly healthy devil's snare in the first-year practical, and Neville had been going every spare hour with the quiet joy of someone discovering the thing they were made for. Ron was at the Quidditch pitch watching the Gryffindor team practice, because Ron had opinions about Quidditch tactics that required an actual Quidditch team to receive them and would not be kept from expressing them indefinitely. Harry sat cross-legged on the floor with the stone in both hands and felt its weight and its warmth for a moment before he opened it. The impression came differently this time. Not a single working, not the construction of the anchor web. This was a sequence, a series of moments strung together like beads on a wire, each one distinct, each carrying its own emotional texture the way stones carry the temperature of the water they've been sitting in. The archive hadn't just preserved the spell. It had preserved the thinking behind it. The first moment, Dumbledore in his 40s, reading. The emotional texture was specific and unmistakable, the focused, world-reshaping feeling of a document that pulls the present forward into a new shape and doesn't pull it back. He was reading a prophecy. Harry couldn't hear words, the stone didn't work in words, but he felt the weight of them. Enormous. Cold. Certain. And beneath the certainty, grief. Real grief, fully felt, not performed. Dumbledore had read the prophecy and understood what he believed it meant and grieved it. He had not enjoyed what came next. Harry kept that. Filed it carefully. The second moment, writing. Meticulous and deliberate, the emotional texture of a man composing something meant to outlive the decisions it justified, meant to be read by a future self and found reasonable. The feeling of it was the texture of an argument with yourself that you are losing, the cycling back and forth, the perhaps another way becoming no, I've checked, there is only this way, and the anchor web following the writing, following the argument, following the grief, constructed with full technical excellence because if you had decided on a terrible necessary thing then half measures only made it more terrible. The third moment stopped him. More recent. An older man's emotional texture, more years in it, and it had the quality Harry recognized instantly once he felt it, someone checking their own work and finding a remainder they hadn't put there. Dumbledore had gone back to the prophecy, reviewed it, re-examined it, and found a gap. Harry couldn't read the specific content, but he felt the gap's shape, a calculation that had worked for 40 years with a digit suddenly missing, a proof developing an unexplained remainder. And then, layered over the doubt, something older and harder. He'd seen the gap. Catalogued it. Managed it. And continued anyway, because 60 years of certainty had momentum that a small doubt couldn't arrest, and the alternative to continuing was dismantling 60 years of his own construction, and there was almost no one alive who could bring themselves to do that. Harry set the stone down. He sat with it for a long time. The fire burned in the grate. The Scottish rain moved against the castle walls in sustained sheets, and the sound of it came through the stone like breathing. He thought about what it meant that Dumbledore had doubted and continued. He thought about the difference between a man who makes a monstrous choice carelessly and a man who makes a monstrous choice and grieves it and makes it anyway, every year, for 60 years, and keeps the grief alive because the grief is the only acknowledgement that what he's doing has a cost. The grief didn't fix anything. The anchor web was real. The decade of managed smallness was real. 51 spells and 10 years at the Dursleys and a childhood built to specifications were real, and the genuine sorrow Dumbledore had carried about it changed none of that, not 1 hour of it. But it changed what Harry needed from the conversation that was coming. He put the stone in his pocket and went to find the headmaster. Dumbledore was at his desk when Harry knocked, writing with the focused attention of someone who had been at it for hours, and he set his quill down without apparent surprise when Harry came through the door. The standing arrangement of chairs at the desk was already waiting. Harry sat without being invited and Dumbledore looked at him with the expression Harry had come to recognize as the real one, more tired than the warmth-deployed version, more complex, more honest in the specific way of someone who has stopped performing for a person they've realized can see through the performance. "I opened the second stone," Harry said. "I expected you would," Dumbledore said. "I felt the doubt." Harry looked at him steadily. "The review. The gap in the reasoning." He paused. "I want to know what the gap was. I want to know the prophecy's exact wording." The office was very quiet. Fawkes on his perch hadn't made a sound since Harry entered. He was watching, both amber eyes open and patient. Dumbledore sat for a long moment. Then he stood and crossed to the small cabinet beside the pensieve, old dark wood, 3 distinct magical seals, the kind of lock that communicated that whatever was inside was not for casual access. He opened it with his wand and took out a crystal phial, small enough to fit in a closed fist, holding something silver blue that swirled slowly in the low office light. He set it on the desk between them. "My memory of the prophecy's delivery," Dumbledore said, sitting back down. "Not a transcription. The full context of how it was spoken, who spoke it, what I understood in the moment." He looked at the phial. "I've revisited it a great many times." "Why keep it as a memory?" Harry asked. "Why not write it down?" "Because a transcription is what I heard," Dumbledore said. "A memory is what I understood, and what I understood was shaped by what I already believed, and I wanted to be able to examine that shaping." He looked at Harry across the desk. "I knew, even when I first made my decisions, that I was interpreting. I wanted to preserve the interpretation intact so I could interrogate it." "Did you?" A pause. "Not as thoroughly as I should have." Harry looked at the phial. "Show me." Dumbledore took the phial to the pensieve on the stone shelf, tipped it in, and the silver-blue substance bloomed across the basin's surface like ink in water. He gestured for Harry to approach, and Harry stood beside him and looked into the swirling surface and then they were both in it. The memory was the Hog's Head Inn. Not as it was now. This was decades ago, the furniture different, the light different, with the quality of something preserved very precisely because the moment had been so significant it had burned itself into perfect recall. A table near the back. A woman sitting across from Dumbledore, large glasses, rather unfocused eyes, the kind of person who you might not look at twice, and then something moved through her, a change in posture and voice that turned her into a vessel for something else entirely. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. The voice was not the woman's. It was hollow and enormous, coming from her throat but not hers, the voice of something that used human mouths as instruments. "Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies." Harry listened. He stood in the preserved memory and listened to every word, and he held each one with the same precision he'd been applying to everything, not rushing past, not importing assumptions, just listening to what the words actually said. "And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. He will have power the Dark Lord knows not. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies." The memory ended. They were back in the office, standing at the pensieve. Harry stood still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to his chair and sat down and thought about the exact words with the careful precision of a person who has just heard something that the person before them heard differently. "Either must die at the hand of the other," Harry said. "That's what it says." "Yes," Dumbledore said. He had returned to his chair. It doesn't say you must die. It says one of you must die at the hand of the other. By the other's hand. Harry looked at him. Voldemort could die. At my hand. Without me dying at all. That is one interpretation, Dumbledore said. It's the literal one, Harry said. The sacrifice interpretation requires adding something that isn't in the words. It requires the premise that the only way I can be in the position to kill Voldemort is if I've already died and come back, or died to destroy his protection. But the words themselves don't say that. Dumbledore was quiet. What made you assume sacrifice? Harry asked. The fire crackled. The silver instruments turned on their stands. Harry watched Dumbledore's face and saw the thing he'd been watching for, not the managed composure, but what was underneath it right now, which was the face of a man who is being asked to say a thing he has never said aloud to anyone. The magic of your mother's sacrifice, Dumbledore said slowly. The love protection she created. I still believe, that Voldemort's connection to you through the killing curse's rebound created a bond that required a specific resolution. A willing death, walking toward it with full knowledge, as she had walked toward hers. He paused. I believed it was the only way to break his connection to the living world. To make him fully mortal and fully killable. That's a theory, Harry said. Based on inference and analogy. A well-reasoned theory, Dumbledore said. Did you test any part of it? Harry asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. The silence was the answer. No, Dumbledore said. You built 60 years of planning around an untested theory about magic that had never happened before, Harry said. And you installed an illegal control system in an infant to make him capable of acting on that theory without questioning it. He held the headmaster's gaze. Because if he questioned it, he might find the gap. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. The office was very still. Even the portrait seemed to have stopped breathing. Yes, Dumbledore said. The words sat in the room. Harry had been expecting many things from this conversation. He'd prepared for deflection, for the warmth deployed as defense, for the greater good framing deployed at full intensity to make the question seem small. He'd prepared for the full Dumbledore, 60 years of constructed authority brought to bear on a single 11-year-old. He had not fully prepared for this, for the man simply saying yes, and meaning it, with the full weight of what it meant pressing down on both of them. There's a connection between Voldemort and me, Harry said. Something created by the killing curse's failure. I know it's real, I can feel him in this school, I could feel him before the spells came off but dimly, through the suppression. Now clearly. He looked at his hands. That part of your theory might be right. I believe it is, Dumbledore said. But the connection doesn't require my death to be broken, Harry said. That's the assumption. That's where the theory becomes a leap. He looked up. What if it requires his death? What if the connection ends when he ends, and the method of ending is what I choose, not what the connection dictates? Dumbledore was very still. I've been thinking about the scar, Harry said. The way it responds to him. The way I can feel where he is, what his emotional state is at high intensity. That's not a bond that protects him, that's a bond that exposes him. I can track him through it. He paused. That might be the power the Dark Lord knows not. Not my raw magical strength, though that seems significant. The connection itself, used against him. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that Harry had never seen on him before and didn't have a name for. It was somewhere between pride and pain, the specific pain of seeing something you should have seen 40 years ago and didn't because you were looking at the problem from the wrong direction, and the specific pride of recognizing it even now. When did you work this out? Dumbledore asked. This week, Harry said. After the corridor confrontation with Quirrell. You confronted Quirrell directly. It wasn't quite a question. His voice had a note in it that might have been alarm if it had been louder. I told him I knew what he was and that I'd be waiting when he made his move for the stone, Harry said. I wanted him to know the situation clearly. Harry, that level of direct provocation, I know what I'm doing, Harry said. Not harshly. Just plainly, the way you say a true thing to someone who needs to hear it stated. I've been thinking about nothing else for 3 weeks. I've mapped the defenses, I've built my team, I've assessed Voldemort's capabilities and limitations through Quirrell's behavior. He looked at Dumbledore. The confrontation wasn't provocation. It was information. I gave him accurate information about the situation so that when he moves with a complete picture, which means he moves predictably, which means I control the timing. Dumbledore stared at him. You gave Voldemort accurate information strategically, he said. Yes. A pause. That is quite sophisticated. I learned it from thinking about what you did, Harry said. You gave everyone accurate information about the specific things that served the plan and withheld the rest. Information control. I'm doing the same thing. He held Dumbledore's gaze. Except I'm telling you everything, because I decided to. The fire. The instruments. The rain against the windows, still insistent. Dumbledore looked at Harry with that unnamed expression and was quiet for a long time, long enough that one of the more wakeful portraits in its frame cleared its throat very softly and then went back to silence. What do you need from me? Dumbledore said finally. It was the right question. Harry noticed that it was the right question and gave it the acknowledgement it deserved. I need to know the full extent of Voldemort's Horcruxes, Harry said. The word landed in the room like a stone into deep water, the ripple of it went out in all directions, and every portrait in the room was suddenly, completely awake, and Fawkes came off his perch with one sharp beat of crimson wings and was in the air for a moment before settling on the desk between Harry and Dumbledore. Dumbledore's face had gone very still. The kind of still that was not composure but shock contained. Where did you hear that word? I reasoned toward it, Harry said. What keeps Voldemort alive? Not the killing curse failing, that protected me, not him. He survived the rebound of his own curse, which means there was something anchoring him to life beyond normal magical resilience. The connection to me is real, but a connection doesn't sustain life. He looked at Dumbledore. There are documented methods of extending life through fragmenting the soul. The books on the restricted shelf don't name it directly, but the theoretical framework is there if you read 3 of them together and follow the logic. He paused. I think there's more than one. The way he's persisting, the way he's been able to possess Quirrell, the way his magic has kept some coherent form for a decade, that's not one anchor. That's multiple. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a very long time. How long did you spend in the library? He asked, quietly. 3 weeks, Harry said. Hermione helped. Miss Granger knows, the theory. Not the word. Harry looked at him. She's going to figure out the word on her own within the month. She's faster than either of us on research. He kept his voice level. Tell me what you know. All of it. Not the version shaped for what you thought I needed to become. The real version. Dumbledore stood. He walked to the window and stood with his hands folded behind his back, looking out at the dark and the rain, and Harry waited. This was not avoidance, it was the particular stillness of a man taking an accounting of something large, summing it up in preparation for speaking it aloud for what might be the first time. There are at least 6, Dumbledore said. His voice was quiet. Possibly more. He had been creating them since his time at Hogwarts. I believe the first was created here, in this castle, when he was a student. The diary. The ring, I believe the ring, I haven't confirmed it. The locket. The cup. The diadem. A pause. And something I have suspected for 2 years but have not spoken aloud, because speaking it aloud would have required me to tell you, and I was not ready for what telling you would mean. Harry looked at his back. At the composed, robed stillness of the man at the window. Me, Harry said. Dumbledore turned. He made one in me, Harry said. Not intentionally. Not as a completed Horcrux, but the soul fragment attached when the killing curse rebounded and the soul was destabilized. It found the only living vessel in the room. The look on Dumbledore's face was the one that had no name. Pain and something beyond pain, the specific anguish of a person who has been carrying a terrible knowledge alone for a long time and has just watched someone else arrive at it independently. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That's why you believed I had to die," Harry said. "Not because of the power configuration. Because of the soul fragment. You believed the only way to destroy it was to destroy the vessel." "I believed," Dumbledore said carefully, and he came back to his chair and sat in it with the weight of someone much older than he was, "that it could not be removed while you lived. That you would have to die for it to be released, and that the protection your mother created would allow you to return from that death. A sacrificial death, yes, but not a final one." "Not final," Harry said. "No. I believed you would survive." "You believed," Harry said. "Based on theory. Untested theory." He kept his voice even. "You planned to walk me toward a death experience and hoped the untested theory held." Dumbledore said nothing. Harry looked at the fire. The anger was there, the clean, cold anger that had been with him since the first morning, but underneath it, newly arrived, was something else. The full architecture of Dumbledore's plan was visible to him now in its entirety, and the entirety of it was, he turned it over, examined it, not senseless. The logic of it was coherent, even elegant in its internal consistency. Dumbledore had seen a prophecy, developed a theory, built a plan around the theory, and executed the plan with extraordinary precision over 60 years. Every piece fit. The anchor web kept Harry manageable. The managed childhood kept him hungry for belonging, so he'd come to Hogwarts grateful and pliable. The monitoring charms kept his development within acceptable parameters. The emotional governors kept his reactions from disrupting the trajectory. And at the end of it, a willing, prepared boy walking toward death in a moment of crisis, dying, and coming back, and somehow in the coming back destroying the fragment and being free to finish Voldemort. It might even have worked. If Fawkes hadn't come. If Fawkes hadn't come, Harry thought, he would have been sitting here now as the managed version, looking at Dumbledore with fond trust and mild confusion about the complexity of the magical world, not understanding what he was or what was being done with him. "The fragment," Harry said. "I can feel it sometimes. There's a quality in my scar that isn't just the connection to Voldemort, there's something underneath it. Older. Colder." He looked at his hands. "I've been thinking about whether it can be removed without death." Dumbledore was very still. "If the fragment is a piece of fractured soul," Harry said, "and soul magic is responsive to living magic, to the host's own core, then theoretically the host's magic could reject it. Not through death. Through deliberate, sustained magical pressure from the inside. The way a body can reject a foreign material." He paused. "It would require enormous magical coherence. A completely unified core pressing outward against the fragment's attachment points." He looked at Dumbledore. "Which would have been impossible with an anchor web suppressing the core." Dumbledore stared at him. "Without the web," Harry said, "it might not be." "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice was different now, stripped of all the layers, the warmth and the management and the strategy all gone, just an old man's voice, "do you understand what you're proposing?" "The process would be painful," Harry said. "Probably. And it might not work. But it's a theory with an actual mechanism, which is more than the sacrifice theory had." He held the old man's gaze. "I'm not asking your permission to try. I'm telling you the plan." He paused. "In the same way you told me the plan for 60 years without telling me." The silence was long. Then, unexpectedly, something moved in Dumbledore's face that Harry hadn't seen there before and didn't know how to categorize except as, the closest word was broken. Not shattered. Just the particular fracture that appears in something that has been under sustained pressure for a very long time when the pressure finally changes direction. "I owe you," Dumbledore said. Quietly. Without inflection or performance. A debt that I do not expect you to absolve. What I built in you, what I took from you, what I planned to do with the life I had no right to plan, I am aware of the weight of it. He looked at Harry with the full, unmanaged reality of his face. I want you to know that the grief was genuine. That it has always been genuine. That there has not been a year, perhaps not a month, in which I did not look at what I had decided and feel the full weight of it. Harry looked at him. I know, Harry said. I felt it in the stone. Dumbledore looked at his hands on the desk. Does it matter? It matters that it was real, Harry said. It doesn't undo anything. But it matters. He paused. What would help more than the grief is what you do now. What do you need? Dumbledore asked, and the question was the same as before but different in texture, less strategic, more genuine, stripped of the framework of the plan. The full record of every Horcrux you've identified, Harry said. Your theories on destruction methods. Your research on the soul fragment in me, everything, not the version shaped for what you thought I'd need. He paused. And Snape. Dumbledore's eyebrows moved slightly. Severus? He needs to know the full picture. Not managed versions, not partial architecture. Everything. He's been working inside your plan without full knowledge for 20 years and he's capable of contributing significantly if he's trusted with the actual situation. Harry looked at the headmaster. He's been thinking for himself since the first day of term. I think he's wanted to for a while. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Severus is complicated. Everyone in this situation is complicated, Harry said. That doesn't mean they can't be trusted with the truth. A long pause. And McGonagall, Harry said. Minerva already suspects, she deserves to know, not suspect. Harry kept his voice level. She's been carrying the weight of suspecting for 10 years and telling herself to trust you, and she told me in the first week that she wants to help. Let her help. He paused. These are the people in this castle who can actually make a difference in the next month. I need all of them working with real information. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk. The old man was doing, Harry could see it, feel it, the same thing he'd felt since the beginning, the rapid, precise assessment of someone who had spent 60 years being the most intelligent person in every room and was now sitting across from someone who was asking him to stand down from that position and was right to ask it and he knew it. The timetable, Dumbledore said. Halloween, Harry said. I think he moves on Halloween. The energy of the day, the thinness of the barrier between states of being, it would be significant to him. Meaningful. He paused. There's something else about Halloween specifically. I haven't found it yet. Dumbledore was very still. What? Harry asked. Your mother died on Halloween, Dumbledore said. Harry had known this. He'd known it abstractly, the way you know dates in history, it was in every book that touched his story. But hearing it in this room, in this conversation, with the full context of the plan and the grief and the 60 years pressing down on the air between them, it landed differently. He'd want the symmetry, Harry said, after a moment. He'd want to come back fully on the anniversary. Yes, Dumbledore said. Harry absorbed that. Then we have 3 days. Yes. Okay. Harry stood. He looked at Dumbledore, at the old man in the chair behind the old desk, in the office full of accumulated history. He felt the complexity of the moment, not warmth, not trust, not forgiveness, not their absence either. Something more difficult and more real than any of those, the frank recognition of what someone was, in full, without managing down the parts that were hard to hold alongside each other. I'm going to finish preparing. I need you to gather McGonagall and Snape tomorrow morning and tell them everything. Not the shaped version. The real version. I will, Dumbledore said. Harry nodded. He picked up his bag. He was at the door when Dumbledore said, behind him, Harry. He stopped. The power the Dark Lord knows not, Dumbledore said. His voice was quiet and careful, the way you speak something you're still examining. I assumed it was love. Your mother's love recreated in you, the protection and sacrifice dynamic. A pause. I may have been wrong about that too. Harry turned. What do you think it is? He asked. Dumbledore looked at him across the office, the distance of the room between them, the fire warm and the portraits finally allowing themselves to breathe. Freedom, Dumbledore said. The power of a person operating entirely from their own authentic will. Something Voldemort has never understood and cannot model, because he has never experienced it and cannot imagine experiencing it. He paused. He understands power, coercion, love as weakness, loyalty as leverage. He has no framework for someone who acts from genuine, unfettered choice. A pause. That boy in the prophecy, the one I tried to build, he would not have had that power. I would have removed it along with everything else. He looked at his hands. The boy in front of me does. Harry stood in the doorway for a moment. Tell them tomorrow, he said. All of it. He went out. The stairs carried him down. The corridor was dark and the castle breathed around him, warm and certain. Fawkes appeared from somewhere, not from the office. He'd left Fawkes there, but Fawkes was suddenly on his shoulder anyway, which Harry was learning was simply something Fawkes could do. He's going to tell them, Harry said. The thrum. It's not enough, Harry said. It doesn't fix anything. He paused. But it's real. And real is what we work with. He walked back through the castle with the 3 days pressing in his chest like something counted and finite, and what he felt was not fear and not excitement but the particular clarity of standing at the edge of something enormous and being completely, utterly himself, no governors, no filters, no architecture managing the response, just Harry, walking through his school toward the thing that needed to be done, choosing every step of it. In the Gryffindor common room, Hermione was at a table with her books and Ron was beside her, and they were arguing about something with the focused energy of people who had been arguing about it for half an hour and were both winning and both losing simultaneously, and Neville was in an armchair watching them with the expression of someone who found this extremely entertaining. Harry came through the portrait hole and all 4 of them looked at him. He sat down. 3 days, he said. They looked at him. He moves on Halloween, Harry said. We have 3 days to be ready. He looked at each of them, Hermione with her precise, focused attention, Ron with his folded arms directness, Neville with his newly steady calm. I've told Dumbledore everything. He's gathering McGonagall and Snape tomorrow. We have actual backup this time, not just the 5 of us and a Phoenix. Ron said, just to be clear, the Phoenix is still a significant part of the plan. Yes, Harry said. Good. Ron unfolded his arms. Because I have some thoughts about the troll situation. Of course you do, Hermione said. They're good thoughts, Ron said. They're going to be tactically impractical, Hermione said. One of them is about using the troll's own momentum against it, which is, actually, Neville said, from his armchair, I had the same thought. About the momentum. Ron looked at Neville. Neville looked at Ron. Hermione looked at both of them with the expression of someone revising a dismissal. Harry looked at all 3 of them in the warm firelight, 3 days before Halloween, and felt something settle in his chest that was solid and warm and entirely his own. Show me the plan, he said.